Escort her out. Now!
Rose was being thrown out.
Do not let her speak to the bride.
Grant wanted her silenced. Maya saw everything.
Aunt Rose! What is happening?
Give me the box, and this ends quietly.
The box terrified him.
Let her go.
Do not sign anything. You need to hear the truth. That man is lying to you, Maya. Your grandmother knew exactly who you would become.
Security will handle her.
His mother helped hide it.
Tell me the truth.
His grandmother left this for you. The twin Charles.
16 months earlier, it all seemed impossible. At 31, Maya had built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and meaningful to anyone who knew her. She taught at a public school on the east side of Briarwood, where she worked with children whose families had learned to measure time in appointments, bus schedules, and insurance denials. Her classroom was full of picture cards, weighted blankets, chipped tables, and little victories that never made the news. Maya knew the names of every child who hated loud rooms, every parent who had learned to apologize for arriving late, and every student who had been told, directly or indirectly, that their needs were too expensive. She had not grown up with much. Her mother, Lila, had been a reading specialist who believed that every child deserved at least one adult who saw potential before behavior. When Lila died suddenly after a brief illness, Maya was 14. Rose, Lila's older sister, had taken her in without speeches or conditions. Rose had worked night shifts as a home care nurse then, and money was always tight. But Maya never remembered feeling unwanted. She remembered packed lunches, secondhand books, birthday cakes that leaned to one side, and a woman who would stay awake until dawn after a double shift just to make sure Maya had finished her homework. Rose never pretended their life was glamorous. She taught Maya how to repair a hem, how to stretch soup across 3 dinners, how to recognize when someone was treating kindness as weakness. There was one lesson, however, that Maya had never fully understood. Rose believed that the people most eager to be admired were often the people least willing to be known. Maya used to think it was simply the wisdom of someone who had spent decades in strangers' homes, watching families perform love for visitors and abandon it when the doors closed. Then Grant Holloway arrived at her school with a camera crew, a group of foundation staff, and a donation large enough to replace the classroom equipment Maya had spent years begging the district to approve. The Holloway Foundation had been a familiar name in Briarwood for as long as Maya could remember. It funded scholarships, literacy centers, hospital wings, and polished advertisements about lifting communities through opportunity. Its founder, Eleanor Holloway, had been remembered as a stern but generous woman who turned a small family business into a philanthropic empire. After Eleanor's death, the foundation passed into the hands of her daughter, Catherine, and her grandson, Grant. They appeared in magazines, stood beside oversized checks, and spoke often about legacy. Grant entered Maya's classroom in a tailored suit that did not quite belong among finger paint and sensory toys. Yet he seemed to know exactly how to make himself fit. He knelt beside a student who had trouble making eye contact. He listened while Maya explained why a new communications device could change a child's day. He asked questions that made her believe he had actually read the proposal rather than simply approved it. By the end of the visit, he had promised not only the devices, but a small grant for teacher training across the district. Maya was careful at first. She had seen wealthy people arrive with announcements and leave before the real work began. But Grant kept returning. He attended school board meetings. He remembered the names of students. He sent handwritten notes after difficult weeks. And when he asked Maya to dinner, he did it without making her feel like a charitable project he had decided to rescue. Their relationship moved quickly, though not carelessly. Grant took Maya to quiet restaurants rather than the places reporters followed him. He listened when she talked about her students, even when the stories had no easy ending. He seemed to admire that she did not chase his money or his family name. In fact, he often said that being with her felt like stepping outside the world that expected something from him every minute of the day. Rose did not share Maya's confidence. She was polite to Grant, never openly hostile, but she watched him in a way that made him uncomfortable. She noticed how his generosity increased when a camera was nearby. She noticed that he asked Maya to send photographs whenever a new device arrived at school, then later claimed those photographs had inspired the Foundation's latest campaign. She noticed the small pauses in his expression when Maya disagreed with him, the faint tightening around his mouth when anyone failed to admire him quickly enough. Still, Rose said little. Maya had spent most of her life being underestimated because of where she came from. Rose did not want to become another person, telling her that happiness was too fragile for someone like them to trust. So she kept her concerns to herself, hoping she was wrong. For a while, it seemed she might be. Grant proposed on a winter evening beneath the lights of a small botanical garden that had been closed to the public for the night. There were no journalists, no celebrity friends, no branded banners. Maya believed that was proof the moment belonged only to them. When she said yes, Grant held her as though he had been waiting his whole life for someone who did not care about the Holloway name. The engagement changed the temperature around them almost immediately. Catherine Holloway began appearing more often, always elegant, always measured, always able to make a criticism sound like concern. She offered to manage the wedding because, as she gently suggested, a marriage into the Holloway family attracted attention, and attention required care. She selected the chapel, the guest list, the flowers, the menus, and eventually most of the people allowed to have an opinion. At first, Maya accepted this as generosity. She had never planned a wedding and did not want to be ungrateful. But Catherine's help came with a quiet process of removal. Maya's co-workers were shifted to a distant table because the room was limited. Rose was advised that a smaller family dinner before the ceremony might be more comfortable than the main reception. A photo of Maya's mother, which Maya wanted near the ceremony flowers, was described as too personal for the visual plan. Each decision seemed minor by itself. Together, they made Maya feel less like a bride and more like a detail being arranged. Grant always found a way to smooth it over. He told Maya his mother had spent her life managing public attention and did not know how to stop. He promised that once the wedding was over, they would build a life with fewer expectations and more space. Maya wanted to believe him. Every time doubt appeared, she reminded herself of the man who had sat on the floor of her classroom and listened to a child struggle to form one sentence. Rose, however, recognized something Maya did not. She had seen Catherine Holloway before, though Maya had never known it. Nearly 20 years earlier, Rose had worked as a private nurse for Eleanor Holloway during the final season of Eleanor's life. By then, Eleanor was no longer the towering public figure people admired from newspaper photographs. She was ill, exhausted, and increasingly troubled by things happening inside the Foundation that carried her name. Rose had been hired because Eleanor wanted someone outside the family. She had told the agency that she needed a nurse who could be trusted not to confuse employment with loyalty to Catherine or Grant. Rose had not understood the significance of that request until the nights when Eleanor could not sleep. On those nights, the old woman spoke less about death than betrayal. She had built the Holloway Foundation to keep children from being discarded by systems that found them inconvenient. Yet she had begun to suspect that her own family was using the foundation as a stage set, moving money through polished programs while the people in greatest need were removed from the picture. Eleanor never gave Rose every detail. She was too careful for that. But she did ask Rose to keep a cedar box hidden where Catherine would never think to look. She told her that the box contained what mattered if the family ever tried to turn compassion into a costume. Rose had promised without understanding how expensive that promise would become. After Eleanor died, Catherine claimed that the final estate documents had been settled. The foundation continued, and Grant grew into its public face. Rose received no invitation to the funeral reception. She kept the box in the back of a linen cabinet for years, telling herself that perhaps the danger Eleanor feared had passed. Then Grant began dating Maya. The first warning came 6 weeks before the wedding, when Rose visited Maya's apartment and found a stack of documents waiting to be signed. Maya had been told they were standard papers connected to her future role at the foundation. Grant wanted her to become the public education ambassador after the honeymoon. He said her work with children made her the perfect person to lead a new initiative. Rose read only a few pages before her hands began to shake. Buried beneath language about reputation, privacy, and coordinated communication was a clause preventing Maya from making public statements about foundation activities without written approval. There were financial penalties, confidentiality rules, and restrictions that would follow her even if she stepped away from the role. It was not a partnership agreement, it was a leash. That night, Rose went home, opened the linen cabinet, and took out the cedar box for the first time in almost 2 decades. Inside, beneath a yellowing knit scarf Eleanor had once used to wrap the documents, were pages bearing the old woman's signature, a sealed letter addressed to Rose, and a thin ledger written in a disciplined hand. The first page of the letter made one thing painfully clear. Eleanor had not asked Rose to protect a fortune. She had asked her to protect people. And if the day came when a Holloway tried to use marriage, charity, or public admiration to silence someone vulnerable, Rose was to make sure the truth reached the light. Rose had no idea how close that day was until the morning of Maya's wedding. The morning of the wedding arrived under a hard, bright sky that made every window of the Holloway estate shine. By 7 o'clock, the chapel garden was already filled with florists, caterers, stylists, photographers, and assistants carrying clipboards. The place looked less like a home than a machine built to manufacture a perfect memory. Every rose had been inspected. Every candle had been placed at the correct height. Every place card had been checked twice. And in the center of it all, Maya was being prepared to marry the man everyone insisted had given her a life beyond anything she could have imagined. Rose arrived alone just after 9. She wore the blue dress Maya had helped her choose, a simple coat against the morning chill, and the old cedar box tucked inside a canvas bag. She had spent the night reading Eleanor's letter until the words blurred. There was no instruction telling her to interrupt a wedding, no sentence ordering her to humiliate Grant or expose the family in front of strangers. Eleanor had only asked her to act before another innocent person became part of a lie. That difference mattered to Rose. She did not want revenge. She did not even want to ruin Grant. What frightened her was the thought of Maya spending years trying to understand why the man she loved had slowly taken control of her voice, her work, and her memories of what was right. Rose had watched that happen to women before. It rarely began with cruelty that anyone else could see. It began with decisions made on their behalf, concerns dismissed as stress, and gratitude demanded in exchange for a comfortable cage. Catherine saw Rose before Maya did. Her eyes moved to the canvas bag, then to Rose's shoes, then to the anxious way Rose searched the corridor for someone who could take her to the bridal room. Catherine greeted her with polished restraint, but the message beneath her manners was immediate. Rose had not been expected to arrive so early, and the family could not allow distractions on a day meant to be photographed from every angle. Rose asked to speak with Maya privately. Catherine explained that the bride was overwhelmed and could not be disturbed. Rose said the matter could not wait. Catherine's expression barely changed, but she sent an assistant to find Grant. Grant appeared several minutes later in his formal suit, surrounded by the calm authority of someone accustomed to people making space for him. At first, he treated Rose like an inconvenience that could be managed. He suggested she give Maya the box after the ceremony. He reminded her that the bride had enough emotions to handle. He implied that an old family matter could surely wait until the guests had gone home. Then Rose told him that the box had belonged to Eleanor. The change in Grant was small, but Rose had spent enough years at bedsides to recognize the body's betrayal of the mind. His shoulders tightened, his gaze dropped toward the bag, and returned too quickly. For a moment, the careful warmth in his face disappeared. He asked Rose what exactly Eleanor had given her. Rose did not answer. She only said that Maya needed to see it before signing anything connected to the Holloway Foundation. That was when Grant stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. He spoke to Rose in the low, controlled manner of a man who knew anger would look bad if anyone overheard. He suggested that grief could distort old memories. He implied that she might be confused by documents she did not understand. He warned her that upsetting Maya on her wedding day would be unforgivable. Rose had heard sharper words in hospital rooms, usually from families who had mistaken fear for authority. She told him that a person who feared the truth before a marriage had no right to ask for trust after it. Grant's face hardened. He did not order the guards to remove her immediately. Not then. He knew that would draw attention. Instead, he asked one of Catherine's assistants to escort Rose to a side lounge and promised that Maya would join her when she was ready. It was a softer form of exile, designed to look considerate. For 20 minutes, Rose sat alone in a room decorated with cream-colored furniture she was afraid to touch. Outside the door, footsteps passed without stopping. The wedding moved forward as though she had already been erased from it. She could hear distant music being tested in the chapel and the low murmur of guests arriving. With every minute, she felt the old weight of hesitation return. Perhaps Maya deserved a quiet day. Perhaps Rose was about to damage the one thing her niece had allowed herself to want. Then she remembered Lila. She remembered Maya at 14, trying to be brave at a funeral because she thought crying would make Rose's burden heavier. She remembered every time Maya had stood up for a child who had been treated as difficult rather than deserving. and she realized that protecting Maya's peace by hiding the truth was not protection at all. It was surrender. Rose left the lounge and headed toward the bridal corridor. The assistant tried to stop her. Rose apologized and kept walking. Catherine saw her approaching and immediately understood what was happening. Grant had just taken his place near the chapel entrance, where the first guests could see him. To anyone watching, he looked composed and proud. But when Rose reached the corridor, his composure cracked. Maya was only a few doors away, surrounded by bridesmaids and makeup artists. She heard raised voices, then stepped into the hall before someone could close the door. Her wedding dress caught the morning light, and for a second, Rose saw the little girl she had raised, dressed for a future Rose had once believed would be safe. Grant moved between them. He told Maya that Rose was tired and upset, that she had become confused about an old matter related to his grandmother. He made it sound merciful, as though he were protecting both women from embarrassment. Maya looked at Rose, waiting for her aunt to deny it or explain. Rose tried to reach into the bag. Grant caught her wrist. It was not a violent movement. That was what made it worse. It was quick, controlled, almost invisible. But Maya saw it. She saw the way Rose flinched. She saw the anger in Grant's eyes before he replaced it with concern. And something inside her shifted. Grant released Rose immediately and tried to draw Maya away from the moment. He reminded her that hundreds of guests were arriving. He spoke about timing, pressure, and how much stress Rose must be under. He made the entire situation sound like a fragile inconvenience that Maya had the duty to manage. Maya asked Rose whether she needed help. Rose looked at her, then at Grant, and made a decision that broke her own heart. She told Maya that she did, but that the truth could not be spoken in a hallway full of people who wanted it hidden. Catherine called security. What happened next was the moment that would later be described in different ways by every person who had witnessed it. Some guests would say Rose refused to cooperate. Others would insist the guards were only guiding her outside. Catherine would claim the family had been concerned for Rose's well-being. Grant would tell anyone who listened that he had tried to protect Maya from a painful misunderstanding. But Maya remembered the facts. She remembered Rose clutching the cedar box. She remembered the guards treating a 68-year-old woman as though dignity were something that could be removed by force. She remembered Grant watching instead of stopping them. And she remembered the hollow feeling that came when a person she loved showed her, without realizing it, who they were. Rose was taken through the side doors and into the driveway. The music inside the chapel swelled. The wedding coordinator hurried Maya toward the room where she was supposed to wait until the processional. Everyone spoke at once, telling her there was no need to worry, no need to ruin the day, no need to let Rose's confusion become a disaster. Maya let them lead her for several steps. Then she stopped. The word disaster lingered in her mind. It was the same word Grant had used 3 weeks earlier when one of his Foundation employees had tried to meet with him after being dismissed. Maya had asked what happened, and Grant had said the employee was creating a disaster because she had misunderstood how professional organizations worked. At the time, Maya had accepted the explanation. Now she remembered the coldness behind it. She looked down at her hands and noticed something folded beneath the white ribbon of her bouquet. Rose must have slipped it there when Grant had grabbed her wrist. It was a single page torn from Eleanor's letter. Maya read it in the quiet of the preparation room while her bridesmaids watched her face change. The handwriting was weak but clear. Eleanor had written that there were people who called themselves guardians of a legacy, while feeding on the very trust they were supposed to protect. She had written that the family's greatest danger was not scandal, but the habit of teaching others to confuse wealth with virtue. And near the bottom of the page, she had left a warning addressed not to Maya by name, but to whoever might one day be asked to marry into the Holloway world. Never sign away your voice in exchange for a place at their table. Maya read the sentence twice. Then she asked her bridesmaids to leave. For the first time all morning, no one told her what the next step should be. Outside, Grant was taking his place near the altar. He believed Rose had been removed. He believed the box was still in her hands, but far enough away to handle after the ceremony. He believed Maya had been surrounded by enough pressure, beauty, and expectation to keep her moving forward. He did not understand that the best thing Rose had ever given Maya was not shelter, food, or even love. It was the ability to recognize the moment when silence became a betrayal. Maya removed her veil, not because she had decided anything yet, but because she needed to see clearly. Then she left the room through the service hallway, past the floral displays and polished mirrors, and walked toward the driveway where Rose was waiting beside the car that had brought her there. The ceremony had not begun, but the marriage was already over. Rose was sitting on the low stone wall near the estate driveway when Maya found her. The security men had stepped back once they realized the bride was walking toward them, but they remained close enough to remind Rose that even outside the chapel, the Holloway family believed they could decide where she belonged. For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. Maya stood in her wedding dress without a veil, carrying a bouquet she no longer knew what to do with. Rose looked smaller than she had that morning, not because she was weak, but because the years of keeping Eleanor's secret had suddenly become visible in the curve of her shoulders. Maya sat beside her and reached for the cedar box. Rose did not hand it over immediately. She asked Maya to understand that whatever happened next had to be Maya's choice. Rose had not come to command her, to punish Grant, or to turn one terrible morning into the only definition of Maya's life. She had come because a marriage could survive disappointment, fear, even ordinary mistakes. It could not survive a foundation built on contempt. Then she opened the box. Inside was the original third codicil to Eleanor Holloway's will, signed before 2 independent witnesses and sealed by a small legal practice outside Briarwood. It had never appeared in the estate papers Catherine presented after Eleanor died. The document did not take every dollar from the Holloway family or hand Rose some secret fortune. Its purpose was more precise. Eleanor had placed the voting control of the foundation into a protective trust to be activated if a member of her family used the organization to conceal fraud, retaliate against employees, or coerce another person into surrendering their voice for the sake of the Holloway name. Rose had also kept a ledger Eleanor compiled during the last months of her life. It tracked grants that were publicly announced but never fully delivered, contracts redirected through companies controlled by Catherine's friends, and scholarships that disappeared from internal lists after the cameras had gone. The final pages contained names. They were not the names of powerful people. They belonged to teachers, community coordinators, social workers, and former foundation employees who had tried to raise concerns and had been quietly pushed out. There was one name Maya recognized at once. It belonged to a woman named Helena Ward, a former director of the Holloway Education Initiative. 3 weeks earlier, Grant had called Helena a disgruntled employee who had tried to create problems after losing her position. Maya had believed him because she wanted to believe him. But the ledger showed that Helena had objected to funds being moved out of school programs and into a marketing campaign designed around Grant's public image. Her dismissal had not been a misunderstanding. It had been retaliation. At the bottom of the box lay the agreement Grant wanted Maya to sign after the wedding. Rose had found a copy among documents left at Maya's apartment. Eleanor's letter explained why it mattered. Grant was not simply inviting Maya to become an ambassador for the foundation. He wanted her to become the moral face of a new campaign while binding her to confidentiality terms that would make it difficult for her to speak if she discovered what the family had done. Maya held the papers in her lap. The chapel bells began to ring behind them, a signal that the ceremony should be starting. For years, she had thought love meant believing in the best version of someone until they proved otherwise. But looking at the documents, she understood that Grant had already proved otherwise. She had simply been given reasons to look away. Rose told her there was one more thing Maya needed to know. Before coming to the wedding, Rose had sent copies of every document to the legal practice named in Eleanor's codicil and to the 3 independent trustees Eleanor had selected long ago. Rose had delayed for years because the evidence alone had not been enough to show the full pattern. But Grant's attempt to bind Maya to silence, combined with his treatment of Rose that morning, had made the pattern impossible to deny. Maya could not undo what Grant had done. She could not bring back the employees who had lost their jobs, or the children whose programs had been cut while the Holloways posed for photographs. But she could refuse to become the next polished layer over the truth. She stood and took Rose's hand. When they walked back into the chapel, the guests turned toward them with the curiosity of people who had waited too long without an explanation. Grant was at the altar beneath an arch of white flowers, looking composed, but increasingly irritated. Catherine sat in the front row, her face fixed in the expression of someone prepared to call anything inconvenient a misunderstanding. Maya did not rush. She did not let the wedding coordinator guide her into position. She walked down the aisle beside Rose, not because Rose needed to be rescued, but because neither of them would be separated again to make someone else comfortable. Grant tried to meet Maya with concern. He made the expression of a man ready to forgive a bride for panicking under pressure. He moved toward her, as though the only obstacle between them was a private emotional moment that could be smoothed over with the right words. Maya stopped several feet away. She told him, before their families and the people who had come to admire them, that there would be no wedding. She said she could not marry a man who treated her aunt's dignity as an inconvenience. She could not marry someone who used charity to build his image while hiding the harm done to the people who trusted him. And she would not sign away her voice so that the Holloway family could keep calling itself generous. The room did not explode into chaos. Real shock rarely does. It arrived as stillness. Grant's first instinct was to deny everything. He insisted that Rose had misunderstood old documents and that Maya had been manipulated on an emotional day. He suggested that the papers belonged in the hands of lawyers, not guests. In a narrow sense, he was right. The documents did belong with lawyers. That was exactly where Rose had already sent them. But Grant made one mistake. In trying to diminish Rose, he revealed the same contempt that had brought them all to that moment. He described her as a former employee who had spent too long attached to the family's past. He spoke as though years of service made her less credible, not more. Several people in the room looked at one another. Some had worked with the foundation. Some had seen the polished version of Grant for years. And suddenly, they remembered the staff members who had vanished The programs announced with fanfare and then quietly abandoned. The questions that had never received answers. Catherine rose from her seat and tried to take control. She suggested postponing the ceremony, moving the discussion somewhere private, protecting Maya from further embarrassment. But Maya understood the language now. Private had always meant hidden. Protected had always meant silenced. She placed the cedar box on the front pew and walked out of the chapel with Rose. The photographs later showed the moment in a way no one could have planned. The bride was still wearing white, but she was not crying. Rose was still carrying her worn canvas bag. Behind them, the flowers, musicians, and imported decorations remained exactly where they had been placed. Expensive proof that beauty could not save a lie once the truth had entered the room. The fallout did not happen in one dramatic afternoon. It happened through letters, audits, meetings, frozen accounts, and people finally realizing they were no longer alone. Within 48 hours, the independent trustees filed for an emergency review of the Holloway Foundation. The legal practice confirmed the authenticity of Eleanor's codicil. Grant's public role was suspended, while outside auditors examined the records, and Catherine resigned from the board before the trustees could vote to remove her. The family's public relations team called it a dispute over estate documents, but that explanation collapsed when former employees began sharing their own records. Helena Ward came forward first, with years of emails showing that Grant's office had delayed grants until media campaigns could be arranged. A regional coordinator described programs cut because the children they served did not fit the right image. A finance manager produced instructions to classify image-building expenses as community outreach. The Holloways had protected themselves by making each person believe their experience was isolated. Once those people compared their records, the pattern was impossible to deny. The investigation found that Grant had inherited a culture of manipulation from Catherine and had learned to make it look modern, polished, and strategic. But he had intensified it. He planned to make Maya the face of an education campaign because her sincerity gave him what money could not buy: credibility. Grant had spent years deciding which children were visible enough to deserve help. In the end, his future depended on the testimony of people he had tried to make invisible. The Protective Trust took control of the foundation's voting rights. It rebuilt the board with teachers, community representatives, former program staff, and independent financial oversight. Grants were reviewed, neglected programs were restored where possible, and the people who had been ignored were finally given a chance to speak before decisions were made again. Grant faced civil cases, financial inquiries, lost partnerships, and the collapse of the public platform he had treated as proof of his worth. More painful to him than the money was the loss of control. For the first time, he could not shape the narrative with a smile, a speech, or a carefully placed photograph. Catherine watched the family name become a symbol of everything Eleanor had tried to prevent. She was undone, not by a stranger, but by the records of the woman she had dismissed as powerless. Rose did not become rich or accept a seat at the head of the foundation. She returned to her small apartment and neighborhood clinic, but the trustees asked her to serve as a community advisor. She agreed only if teachers and families had more influence than donors. Maya took time away from work after the wedding that never happened. She grieved the man she thought Grant was, the future she had imagined, and the embarrassment of having nearly walked into a life designed to shrink her. But she did not regret leaving. She learned that heartbreak was not proof of weakness. Sometimes it was proof that a person had chosen truth before comfort. Months later, Maya returned to her classroom. The room still had chipped tables, picture cards, and students who needed more help than the system could easily provide. But the Holloway Foundation, now under new oversight, funded the program without camera crews or branding requirements. Maya refused the title of ambassador when the trustees offered it. She chose instead to help create a teacher-led advisory group that no single wealthy family could control. On the first day the new devices arrived, Maya watched one of her students use a communication screen to tell his mother that he was happy. It was a small sentence. No newspaper printed it. No donor stood nearby to claim credit. Yet Maya thought of Eleanor, of Rose, and of all the people whose names had been hidden in a ledger because someone believed their lives were not impressive enough to matter. That was the lesson Grant Holloway never understood. A person's value is not measured by the room they are allowed to enter, the clothes they can afford, or the power they seem to hold. It is measured by what they do when someone else's dignity is placed in their hands. And sometimes, the person everyone tries to remove from the room is the only one carrying the truth that can save it. If this story moved you, remember this. Never confuse polished appearances with good character. The way someone treats those they believe cannot help them will always reveal more than the words they use in public. Flight 718 entered the storm.
Captain's down! I need help!
Lightning tore across the cabin.
Everyone stay seated.
Then the captain collapsed.
Captain, stay with me!
All 186 lives held still.
Can anyone here fly this aircraft?
From seat 34B, Maya stood.
I can help.
She had no uniform or badge, only an old leather bag and a name the airline feared.
He said she could not fly.
She was fired for a reason.
3 years earlier, Maya wore captain stripes.
Sign the report, then walk away.
It started with one missing number.
The records don't match.
But to understand why Graham Voss was more afraid of Maya Reed than of the storm outside, we have to go back 3 years, to the morning she first noticed a single missing number in an aircraft maintenance record. At the time, Maya still wore the Aurora Skies uniform with pride. She had earned every stripe on it the difficult way. There had been no family money paying for flight hours, no powerful relatives opening doors, and no easy path from the neighborhood where she grew up to the left seat of a commercial aircraft. Her father, Daniel Reed, had spent most of his life working beneath airplanes rather than inside them. He was an avionics technician, one of those men passengers never saw, but depended on every time a plane rose above the clouds. Daniel had taught Maya that aircraft did not become dangerous all at once. A disaster rarely began with fire, smoke, or a screaming alarm. More often, it began with one small shortcut that nobody wanted to question. A number entered incorrectly. A warning cleared too quickly. A part marked as replaced when it had only been reset. A supervisor deciding that a delay would cost more than a risk. When Maya was a little girl, she used to sit beside him in the garage while he repaired radios, test panels, and old electrical equipment from the hangar. He would place a wiring diagram in front of her and explain that every line had a purpose. Even the smallest connection mattered because machines did not care whether people were tired, impatient, rich, or powerful. A system either worked properly or it did not. Those lessons stayed with Maya long after she became a pilot. She was never the loudest captain at Aurora Skies, She did not enjoy drawing attention to herself. She did not try to impress crews by acting fearless. What made her respected was the fact that she prepared more carefully than anyone expected. She studied weather patterns before every flight. She read maintenance notes instead of skipping past them. She listened to ground crews. She checked again when something did not make sense. That habit had saved passengers from minor trouble more than once. A faulty cargo warning, an incorrect fuel figure, a hydraulic message that turned out to be nothing serious. Most people in the company saw those delays as inconveniences. Maya saw them as proof that carefulness was not paranoia. Then came Flight 216 from Dallas to Phoenix. It was an ordinary overnight route. The passengers were tired. The cabin crew wanted an on-time departure. The weather was clear, and the aircraft had already been delayed once because of a late inbound connection. It should have been a simple flight, the kind people forgot the moment they landed. But while reviewing the maintenance log, Maya noticed that an electrical distribution unit had been marked as replaced during the previous week. The entry looked complete at first glance. The date was there. The technician's name was there. The maintenance release was signed. Only one thing was missing: the serial number of the replacement unit. For most people, it would have meant nothing. A missing number in a long page of technical records could easily be a clerical mistake. But Maya knew that components like that were tracked for a reason. A part's serial number told the company where it came from, how old it was, what service history it carried, and whether it had been connected to previous incidents. She asked the ground maintenance team to verify the record. The technician checked the paperwork, then checked again. He looked uncomfortable. He told Maya the part had been inspected and the aircraft was safe to fly. Maya did not accuse him of lying. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked to see the replacement documentation. It was not available. She asked for the maintenance supervisor. The supervisor arrived irritated, already aware that passengers were waiting at the gate. He explained that the component had been dealt with, that the issue was minor, and that the aircraft had completed several flights since then without any problems. Maya understood the pressure. Every minute on the ground cost the airline money. Every delay created complaints. Every cancellation turned into a report that climbed upward through management. But an aircraft was not safer because it had been lucky. She refused to sign the release until the records were verified. The flight was delayed. Passengers complained. Gate agents apologized. The company's operations center called repeatedly. By the time the documents finally arrived, the problem had been explained away as a simple database error. The part had supposedly been replaced correctly, and the missing number had supposedly been omitted during a system transfer. Maya allowed the flight to continue only after the aircraft passed a more detailed inspection. It landed safely in Phoenix. But Maya could not forget the feeling she had when she looked at that incomplete record. Over the next several months, she started noticing similar inconsistencies across Aurora Skies' older fleet. A repeated electrical warning that disappeared after a reset. A maintenance sign-off completed at a time when the technician had been assigned to another airport. Components marked as replaced without a matching inventory transfer. Aircraft that seemed to suffer the same minor problems again and again, but never long enough to trigger a formal grounding. At first, Maya believed the airline had a paperwork problem. Then she began to suspect that it had a safety problem. The more she looked, the more patterns appeared. The aircraft involved were not random. Many belonged to the same group of older planes that had been modified during a cost-cutting program. Several had used components supplied by a contractor called Horizon Avionics Solutions. The company had been praised publicly for helping Aurora Skies reduce maintenance expenses and improve turnaround time. But Daniel Reed had once warned Maya about companies that made their profits by promising that expensive problems could disappear cheaply. He had told her that the cheapest part was often the most expensive one in the long run. Maya compiled everything she found into a formal safety report. She was careful. She did not write with anger. She did not make accusations she could not prove. She listed the aircraft numbers, the dates, the recurring warnings, the incomplete records, and the supplier details. Then she requested an independent audit. For 2 weeks, no one responded. At first, she assumed the report had been lost in the system. Then she received an invitation to a private meeting with Aurora Skies management. That was where she met Graham Voss for the first time. Back then, Voss was not yet the chief executive officer. He was the airline's chief operations strategist, a title that sounded technical enough to be trusted and vague enough to hide the power behind it. He was known for saving money without appearing cruel. He had a talent for making difficult decisions sound reasonable. Investors liked him because profits rose wherever he went. Executives liked him because he never created public scandals. Employees feared him because people who crossed him often found themselves quietly removed from the path ahead. Maya entered the meeting room believing someone had finally taken her concerns seriously. Voss greeted her warmly. He praised her flight record. He spoke about her discipline, her professionalism, and the fact that Aurora Skies needed pilots who cared deeply about safety. Then the tone shifted. He suggested that Maya had become too emotionally invested in technical details outside her direct area of responsibility. He explained that maintenance teams had already reviewed the issue. He reminded her that pilots and engineers needed to trust one another. He implied that her persistence was creating tension inside the company. Nothing he said sounded openly threatening. That was what made it dangerous. By the end of the meeting, Maya realized that Voss was not trying to understand her report. He was trying to make her doubt it. He wanted her to believe that asking questions had made her difficult. He wanted her to believe that being careful had made her disruptive. He wanted her to feel ashamed for caring more about the truth than the company's image. Maya left the meeting unsettled, but she did not withdraw the report. Instead, she filed a second one. That was when Aurora Skies stopped treating her as an employee and began treating her as a problem. Within weeks, Maya was removed from active flight duty pending an internal review. No one explained what the review involved. No one gave her a clear timeline. She was asked to attend meetings where people spoke around the issue without ever addressing it directly. Her supervisors became distant. Colleagues who once trusted her stopped returning messages. Then the rumors began. Anonymous sources told aviation websites that a captain at Aurora Skies had repeatedly caused delays by overreacting to minor maintenance concerns. Industry forums began discussing an unnamed pilot who had supposedly clashed with ground crews. A columnist wrote about the danger of allowing personal anxiety to influence professional judgment. Maya's name was not mentioned at first. It did not need to be. Inside the airline, everyone knew who the story was about. Months later, when Aurora Skies finally released its decision, the company did not accuse Maya of misconduct. They did not claim she had broken any regulation. They did not say she was unqualified. They used softer words. They stated that her employment had ended because of concerns about professional collaboration and operational judgment. It was enough. Her licenses remained valid. Her training record remained strong. But no major airline wanted to hire a pilot whose former company had quietly labeled her a risk. Maya appealed. She requested access to the maintenance records that had prompted her report. She contacted regulators. She spoke to lawyers. But every path seemed to lead back to the same invisible wall. The airline insisted that its fleet was safe. The records she requested were delayed, restricted, or declared confidential. Her report was marked as unsubstantiated. The company moved on, and so did everyone else, except Maya. She did not stop believing that something was wrong. She simply ran out of people willing to listen. The hardest part was not losing the uniform. It was losing the future she had spent her entire life building. For years, she had imagined the first day she would become a captain. She had imagined the weight of the jacket on her shoulders, the sound of her name spoken over the cabin speakers, and the quiet pride on her father's face when he saw her standing beside an aircraft. Daniel Reed had lived long enough to see her earn that title, but he did not live long enough to see what Aurora Skies did to her. He had died a year before Maya filed the report, leaving behind a small metal case filled with old notes, component numbers, supplier records, and handwritten observations from his own years in aviation. At the time, Maya had thought of it only as a piece of him she could not bear to throw away. She carried that case everywhere, not because she believed it contained the answer to anything, but because it reminded her that someone had once taught her not to look away when the truth became inconvenient. After Aurora Skies pushed her out, Maya took whatever work she could find. She taught emergency procedures at a simulator center outside the city. She trained student pilots who dreamed of flying for airlines one day. She showed them how to handle engine failures, severe weather, rapid descents, and instrument malfunctions. At night, after the students went home, Maya sometimes stayed behind. She would sit alone in the simulator, surrounded by artificial screens and plastic controls, looking at a runway that was not real and listening to a wind that did not exist. She still knew every procedure. She still remembered every call-out. She still dreamed about flying. But she no longer believed the industry would ever allow her back into a real cockpit. That was why she had booked the cheapest seat she could find on Aurora Skies Flight 718. She was traveling to an interview for a small training position in another state. The job did not offer prestige. It did not offer a captain's salary. It did not even guarantee that she would ever fly a real aircraft again. But it offered something she had almost stopped expecting: a reason to stay close to the sky. She had boarded the flight quietly, kept her head down, and chosen seat 34B near the back. She had no idea Graham Voss would be sitting in first class. She had no idea Captain Luis Herrera would collapse. She had no idea that the aircraft would enter a storm, carrying the exact kind of danger she had tried to expose. But when the cabin lights flickered and the first warning chime sounded, Maya felt something old awaken inside her. Not panic. Recognition. The sound was wrong. The pattern was wrong. And when Nora Bell asked if anyone on board knew how to fly, Maya had understood that remaining silent would be the same as helping the lie survive. So she stood. Now, as Nora guided her toward the cockpit, Maya could feel the eyes of the passengers following her. Some looked hopeful. Some looked afraid. A few looked at her with the same suspicion Graham Voss had planted in the cabin only moments earlier. But Maya did not look back. She had spent 3 years trying to prove that she belonged in the sky. This time, she did not need anyone's permission. The cockpit door opened. The air inside was cold and sharp. Rain hammered against the windshield. Captain Herrera lay unconscious in the left seat, while 2 passengers with medical training worked beside him. Evan Cole, the first officer, was gripping the controls with both hands, trying to manage the aircraft, the weather, the warning systems, and his own fear all at once. Maya stepped forward. Then she looked at the maintenance display. For 1 second, everything inside her went still. The aircraft registration number glowing on the screen was one she knew. It belonged to one of the exact planes listed in the report Aurora Skies had buried 3 years earlier. And suddenly, Maya understood that the storm was not the only thing trying to bring Flight 718 down. The moment the cockpit door closed behind Maya Reed, the storm stopped being something she could watch from a passenger window. It became a living force that pressed against every surface around her. Rain struck the windshield in violent sheets. Lightning turned the cockpit white for half a second at a time. Warning tones rose and disappeared beneath the growl of the engines, while the aircraft shuddered through air that no longer felt stable. Captain Luis Herrera sat motionless in the left seat, his eyes closed, his body held in place by the harness. He had collapsed only minutes earlier, leaving Evan Cole, the young first officer, alone with a medical emergency, severe weather, and a panel of instruments that seemed to be losing faith in themselves one screen at a time. Evan did not look like the kind of pilot who had ever imagined failure. He was trained, polished, and careful. He had spent years learning procedures, memorizing limitations, and proving that he belonged in the right seat of a commercial jet. But training had a way of becoming something very different. When the cockpit was dark, the captain was unconscious, and 186 lives were sitting behind a locked door. Maya understood that fear. She had known it long before Aurora Skies had taken her uniform, her cockpit, and the career she had once believed would define her life. Fear was not always loud. Sometimes it sat quietly in the room, hiding behind a steady voice and a professional posture, waiting for one small failure to become another. She did not begin by trying to take control of everything. That would have been useless. Evan was still flying the aircraft. The engines were still running. The airplane still had a path through the storm, even if that path was narrowing by the second. What Evan needed was not someone to make him feel smaller. He needed someone who could separate the emergency into pieces small enough to survive. Maya told him to stay with the essentials: airspeed, altitude, direction. Nothing else mattered until those things were secure. The rest of the cockpit could flash, chime, and threaten all it wanted. Panic would come from trying to solve every problem at once. Survival would come from handling the next problem first. For a few seconds, Evan's breathing slowed. His hands remained tight around the controls, but they stopped moving with the helpless urgency of someone searching for a miracle. Maya watched him settle into the rhythm of the work. He was still frightened. He was still young, but he was listening. Outside the cockpit, Nora Bell moved through the cabin with the kind of calm that could only come from someone who understood how much people needed to borrow courage from another person. She did not promise the passengers that everything would be fine. Promises were dangerous at 37,000 feet. Instead, she gave them instructions, routines, and the steady presence of someone who refused to let fear become contagious. Most of the passengers did not know exactly what had happened. They only knew that the captain had stopped speaking. The lights had flickered, and the storm outside looked less like weather and more like a wall. Some held hands with strangers. Some stared at the ceiling as if the aircraft might answer their questions. Some prayed in silence. And in first class, Graham Voss sat surrounded by comfort that suddenly meant nothing. Voss had spent his life believing that every crisis could be controlled by the right person in the right room. He knew how to make nervous investors feel confident. He knew how to turn bad press into reassuring language. He knew how to bury a problem beneath legal statements and polished smiles. But the cockpit of Flight 718 was not a boardroom. It did not care who owned the company, who had influence, or who could afford the best attorneys. The Storm did not recognize titles, and for the first time in years, Graham Voss was trapped in a place where the woman he had tried to erase was more valuable than he was. Maya studied the flickering displays, while Evan followed the emergency procedures. A navigation screen went dark, returned, then began showing incomplete information. One electrical warning appeared and disappeared. Another followed. The failures were not dramatic enough to look like a total collapse, but they were too strange to ignore. They came in bursts, almost as if the aircraft were trying to tell them something and could not decide whether it had the strength to keep speaking. Then Maya saw the aircraft registration number on a small maintenance screen. For one moment, the Storm disappeared from her mind. She knew that aircraft, not because she had flown it often, but because she had seen its records before. 3 years earlier, when she had still worn Aurora Sky's captain's stripes, she had found a missing number in a maintenance report tied to an electrical replacement. At the time, it had looked like a small inconsistency, a missing serial number, a skipped verification line, a document that seemed to have been cleaned too carefully. But Maya had learned from her father that the smallest missing detail could carry the largest warning. Daniel Reed had worked around aircraft systems for most of his life. He was not famous. He did not have a high-ranking office or a seat in executive meetings. He was simply the kind of technician who noticed what other people ignored. He noticed when parts were listed as new, but carried the wear of older units. He noticed when records were signed too quickly. He noticed when aircraft behaved differently after rain, after heavy electrical demand, or after long hours in difficult weather. He had never believed that danger announced itself loudly. Most danger, he used to say, began as something people found convenient to overlook. Maya had carried that lesson with her into every cockpit she had ever entered. And now, as she watched the displays flicker on Flight 718, she understood something that made her chest tighten. The Storm had not created the problem. The Storm had forced it into the open. She asked Nora to bring the worn leather bag from her seat in row 34B. Nora did not ask why. She had seen enough in Maya's face to understand that this was not a request made out of fear. It was a request made because Maya had found a thread, and she intended to follow it. While Nora made her way through the cabin, Evan reported the aircraft status to air traffic control. He declared the medical emergency. He reported the electrical failures. He requested priority handling. His voice was still strained, but it had changed. It no longer sounded like someone waiting to be rescued. It sounded like someone beginning to believe he might be able to help rescue others. Then Aurora Sky's operations called the cockpit. At first, the voice on the radio sounded controlled and professional. The operations representative asked about the captain's condition, the instrument failures, and the aircraft's ability to continue. But then came a question that did not belong in an emergency call. They asked whether Maya Reed was in the cockpit. For a moment, the Storm seemed quieter. Evan looked toward Maya. Nora, who had returned with the leather bag, stood near the cockpit door and understood immediately that the company had not learned Maya's name by accident. Graham Voss had already made his calls. He had already started trying to shape the story before the aircraft had even touched the ground. Maya had once been afraid of what her name could do to her. She had watched it become a warning whispered in airline offices. She had watched former colleagues avoid her, because defending her might make them inconvenient too. She had watched her career become a rumor that other people used to protect themselves, but the storm had stripped away every reason to be afraid. She told operations the truth. She was a former Aurora Skies captain with experience on that aircraft type. She was assisting the first officer during an active medical emergency. The aircraft needed priority. The crew needed a safe runway. Nothing else mattered. The operations representative suggested a diversion to a larger company-controlled airport farther away, where Aurora Skies could send its own staff and manage the emergency privately. It sounded reasonable to anyone who did not understand what the aircraft was telling them. But Maya understood. A farther airport meant more time inside the storm. More time meant more moisture, more electrical demand, more chances for the unstable system to fail again. And a company-controlled airport would give Graham Voss more time to gather people, shape records, and decide which version of the truth the world would hear first. Maya did not argue emotionally. She did not mention Voss. She did not make accusations over an open radio frequency. She simply explained the facts to Evan, and Evan made the decision that mattered. Graybridge Field was closer. Graybridge Field had a runway long enough for the aircraft if the approach remained stable. Graybridge Field had emergency crews ready, and Graybridge Field was the safest option they had. The controller confirmed the diversion. That was the moment Graham Voss began to lose control. Behind the cockpit door, he could still make phone calls. He could still speak to company lawyers and senior executives. He could still try to convince himself that the situation could be contained. But every minute, Flight 718 moved toward Graybridge Field. The possibility of containment became smaller. If the aircraft landed safely, investigators would examine it. If investigators examined it, they would find the electrical components. If they found the components, they would find the maintenance records. And if they found the records, they might discover why Maya Reed had been forced out 3 years earlier. Nora returned to the cabin after bringing Maya's bag forward. She moved from row to row with a steadiness that kept the passengers from seeing how serious the situation had become. A young mother held her daughter close. An elderly man kept his eyes shut and whispered words only he could hear. A boy with a small toy airplane no longer asked his mother whether they would be all right. He simply gripped the toy in both hands and stared at the darkness beyond the window. Near the front of the cabin, one passenger stood despite the seatbelt sign and demanded answers. He wanted to know why the captain was not speaking. He wanted to know why a woman with a controversial past had been allowed into the cockpit. He spoke loudly because fear often tries to disguise itself as anger. Nora did not give him the story he wanted. She told him that the crew was handling an emergency and that everyone on board needed to remain seated. When he continued to protest, the aircraft dropped hard through a pocket of turbulence. His balance disappeared before his argument did. He grabbed the top of a seat and realized in one sudden and humiliating instant that there were no important passengers on that airplane. There were only people who needed the crew to bring them home. He sat down. In the cockpit, Maya opened the old metal case from her bag. Inside were the notes her father had kept for years. Some were stained from workshops and rain. Some were folded at the corners. Some carried diagrams that only someone trained to recognize patterns would understand. Daniel Reed had never expected those pages to become evidence. He had written them because he believed that knowledge had a duty. If something dangerous was happening, someone had to leave a record of it. Maya found the page she was looking for. It described a family of electrical units that could behave unpredictably under extreme moisture and fluctuating demand. The failures could begin quietly. A display could reset. A warning could blink and disappear. A circuit could recover just long enough for someone to decide there was no real problem. But under pressure, the instability could spread. Maya looked from the notebook to the failing display. The patterns matched. It was not proof of every detail. Not yet. But it was enough to understand the immediate danger. The aircraft still had reliable primary data. The engines were stable. The flight controls were responding. But the electronic systems could no longer be trusted completely. And the longer they stayed inside the storm, the more dangerous that uncertainty became. She explained what she believed to Evan without overwhelming him. The goal was not to solve 3 years of corruption in the middle of a storm. The goal was to land the airplane before the next failure took away something they could not afford to lose. Evan listened. Then he did something Maya would remember long after the flight was over. He stopped trying to prove that he was in control. Instead, he accepted help. That was the difference between arrogance and courage. Arrogance demanded that a person face danger alone, so no one could see them afraid. Courage understood that survival sometimes required trusting the person beside you. The descent toward Greybridge Field began. The aircraft entered lower cloud, where the rain felt heavier and the turbulence sharper. Every few seconds, lightning exposed the wings before returning them to darkness. The runway lights appeared once through the weather, then vanished again. The cockpit was no longer full of alarms, but the silence between the warnings felt worse. Air traffic control reported worsening wind conditions. Rainwater had begun pooling along parts of the runway. Several aircraft had already diverted. Emergency vehicles were waiting near the landing area, their lights reflecting through the storm like distant signals from another world. Maya studied the approach information. The conditions were difficult, but not impossible. That distinction mattered. They did not have a normal landing ahead of them. They had an exhausted first officer, a captain who could not help, unreliable displays, a severe crosswind, and a system defect that seemed to be spreading through the aircraft in slow, deliberate waves. But they also had a runway. They had engines. They had enough instruments. And they had time if they did not waste it. Maya told Evan they would need to prepare for a manual approach. The automated systems had done enough to bring them close, but the final moments would depend on human judgment. Evan hesitated, not because he did not understand, but because he understood exactly how much was being asked of him. Maya did not tell him to be fearless. She reminded him that fear was not the enemy. Losing focus was. He had the aircraft beneath his hands. He had the runway ahead. He had the training he had spent years earning. And he had someone beside him who knew what it felt like to carry a room full of strangers through the worst moment of their lives. Evan nodded. The clouds thinned for a few seconds. Below them, Greybridge Field appeared. The runway lights glowed through the rain, narrow and distant, surrounded by darkness. For one brief moment, everyone in the cockpit could see where they needed to go. Then a powerful gust hit the aircraft from the side. The plane rolled sharply. A warning tone sounded. The remaining navigation display flickered again. Evan's breath caught. The runway vanished behind rain. And somewhere in the cabin, 186 people realized that the most dangerous part of the flight had only just begun. For a few seconds, there was no runway. There was only rain. There was only wind. There was only the violent sound of an aircraft being pushed sideways through the dark by forces no human being could control. Evan tightened his grip on the controls, but Maya could see the moment when fear tried to take over again. It was there in the way his eyes moved too quickly from one instrument to another. It was there in the breath he did not finish. It was there in the silence that came just before someone either found their training or lost it. Maya stayed with him. She did not take the airplane from his hands. She did not try to become the hero of the story by doing everything herself. Evan was the pilot flying, and the only way they would survive was if he remained connected to the aircraft instead of surrendering to panic. So Maya gave him one instruction at a time. She kept his attention on the remaining instruments. She helped him trust the physical feel of the aircraft when the screens could not be trusted. She reminded him that a crosswind did not need to be defeated. It needed to be understood. The plane would move. The storm would push. Their job was not to force the sky into obedience. Their job was to make the next correct decision before the next dangerous second arrived. Behind them, Nora kept the cabin from falling apart. The passengers could feel the descent. They could feel the aircraft being thrown from side to side. They heard the engines change as Evan adjusted power. They heard the storm strike the fuselage like heavy stones. Some people cried. Some people held the hands of strangers. Some stared at the seatbacks in front of them because looking out the window felt impossible. Nora moved through that fear with the quiet strength of someone who understood that people did not always need answers. Sometimes they needed a face that told them they had not been abandoned. She checked seatbelts. She helped a frightened child hold on to a parent's hand. She guided an elderly passenger through slow breaths. And when panic rose near the front of the cabin, she did not allow it to become a fire that spread through the rows. Even Graham Voss had gone quiet. The man who had tried to stop Maya from reaching the cockpit could no longer pretend that he was protecting anyone. Every new movement of the aircraft reminded him that the woman he had tried to destroy was now helping save his life. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that the truth was not dangerous because it embarrassed him. The truth was dangerous because it had consequences. The runway lights appeared again. This time, they did not vanish immediately. They were still distant, still blurred by rain, still narrow enough to make the approach feel unforgiving. But they were there. Evan saw them. Maya saw them. And in that moment, the cockpit changed. Not because the danger had passed, but because uncertainty had become a direction. The aircraft continued downward. Wind struck again, harder than before. The nose shifted. The wings dipped. The wet runway moved across the windshield, then disappeared at the edge of Maya's vision. Evan corrected too sharply at first, then steadied himself when Maya reminded him to make smaller movements. The storm wanted panic. It wanted a desperate reaction. But Maya had learned long ago that the most dangerous mistakes were usually born from trying to fix everything too fast. The plane crossed the threshold. For one endless second, it seemed as though the runway would remain just out of reach. Then the wheels touched down. The landing was hard. The aircraft hit the wet pavement with enough force to throw the cabin forward against its seatbelts. Water erupted from beneath the tires. Reverse thrust filled the night with a roar. The runway lights streaked past the windows as Evan held the aircraft straight through the wind. No one cheered immediately. The people in the cabin were too afraid to trust what they had felt. They waited. They waited for the engines to quiet. They waited for the violent shaking to stop. They waited for the aircraft to slow enough for their bodies to believe what their minds could not yet accept. Then Flight 718 came to a stop. For several seconds, there was only rain tapping against the fuselage and the broken sound of people trying to breathe again. Then someone began to cry. Someone else began to clap. The applause spread slowly. Not as celebration at first, but as release. People held one another. Parents pressed their faces into their children's hair. Strangers, who had never spoken before, reached across the aisle and touched each other's hands. They had gone into the storm as passengers, but they came through it as witnesses to the same impossible night. In the cockpit, Evan leaned back from the controls with the stunned expression of a man who had just discovered how close he had come to losing everything. He had not flown perfectly. No one could have in those conditions. But he had stayed present. He had listened. He had learned that courage was not a performance. It was a decision made over and over again when every part of you wanted to give up. Maya sat beside him, exhausted, but still. She did not raise her arms. She did not ask for recognition. She looked through the rain-streaked windshield toward the emergency lights waiting on the runway. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to feel something she had tried not to need. She felt seen, not by executives, not by reporters, not by the company that had taken everything from her. She felt seen by the truth itself. Captain Luis Herrera was taken from the cockpit after the aircraft had stopped and received urgent medical care. He survived. The medical crisis had been serious, but it was not the end of his story. Later, after he learned what had happened, he would understand that the people he had trusted behind him had carried his passengers through the one moment when he could not. But the night was not over. The moment the wheels touched the ground, Flight 718 stopped being only an emergency landing. It became evidence. Investigators entered the cockpit before the storm had fully moved away from Graybridge Field. They secured the flight data. They documented the electrical warnings. They examined the maintenance history. They took custody of the component information. And when Maya placed her father's metal case on the table in the airport interview room, the old notes that had once seemed like the private worry of an ignored technician became part of a much larger question. Why had the aircraft failed the way it had? Why did its maintenance records contain gaps? Why had Maya Reed been removed from Aurora Skies after raising similar concerns 3 years earlier? And why had Graham Voss seemed so terrified the moment he learned she was in the cockpit? Voss tried to regain control the way he always had. He made calls. He asked for lawyers. He attempted to frame the situation as an unfortunate combination of weather, a medical emergency, and an employee with a personal grievance against the airline. He wanted investigators to see Maya as a former captain who had returned to the cockpit carrying old resentment. But that story collapsed as soon as the evidence began to speak. The flight data recorder showed the sequence of electrical failures. The maintenance records revealed repeated component changes that did not match the parts supposedly installed. The missing number Maya had noticed years earlier turned out not to be a harmless clerical error. It had broken the chain of identification for a series of units that should never have returned to active aircraft service. Components had been listed as new when they had been rebuilt, relabeled, and moved through a supplier called Horizon Avionics Solutions. At first, Horizon appeared to be only another vendor in a complicated aviation supply chain. Then investigators followed the money. They found payments routed through companies that existed mostly on paper. They found contracts approved through layers of signatures designed to make responsibility difficult to trace. They found maintenance supervisors who had been pressured to sign forms they did not fully understand. They found workers who had been told that raising questions would cost them their jobs. And eventually, they found the financial links that connected Horizon Avionics Solutions to a network of shell companies controlled by people loyal to Graham Voss. The same man who had called Maya unstable had profited from the weakness she had tried to expose. The same man who had treated safety reports as obstacles had built a system that rewarded silence. The same man who had tried to stop Maya from reaching the cockpit had known exactly why she could not be allowed to speak. Once the truth began moving, it moved faster than Voss could contain. Former mechanics came forward. Record specialists came forward. A retired quality control manager produced copies of internal emails that had been saved in private because he had never trusted the company to keep them. A supervisor admitted that some replacement units had been approved under pressure, even when the documentation was incomplete. Another employee revealed that Maya's report had not been dismissed because it lacked evidence. It had been dismissed because it had too much. And every new witness made the old story harder to believe. Maya was called to testify before an aviation oversight panel weeks later. She arrived wearing no captain's uniform. She did not need one. The uniform had never been the source of her authority. Her authority came from the fact that she had seen danger, spoken about it, and refused to become silent when silence was easier. She did not turn the hearing into revenge. She did not raise her voice. She explained what she had found 3 years earlier. She explained why the missing number mattered. She explained how maintenance records were supposed to protect passengers, not protect executives. She explained that safety was not a slogan painted on a corporate wall. It was a series of decisions made by ordinary people who either chose to tell the truth or chose to look away. Then she opened her father's metal case. Inside were the notes Daniel Reed had written before anyone believed they would matter. He had spent his life trying to make aircraft safer. He had never asked for a title. He had never asked to be remembered. He had only believed that someone had to leave a record when something did not feel right. For years, that record had been ignored. Now it sat before the people who had the power to act. Graham Voss watched from across the hearing room as the story he had spent years controlling came apart piece by piece. The reports he had buried returned as evidence. The maintenance signatures he had trusted became questions. The missing number he had believed no one would notice became the thread that pulled the entire deception apart. His downfall was not dramatic because he shouted or confessed in front of cameras. It was dramatic because he had built his power on the belief that no one would ever make him answer for what he had done. And now, one by one, people were asking. The board removed him from his position. Federal investigators opened criminal cases connected to fraud, falsified maintenance records, and the financial network behind Horizon Avionics Solutions. Months later, Graham Voss was taken into custody, while the same news cameras he had once tried to manage waited outside. There was a certain justice in the way it happened. Voss had spent years using paperwork to hide danger. In the end, paperwork exposed him. He had silenced people by making them feel small. In the end, the people he had ignored became the witnesses who brought him down. He had treated Maya Reed's name like a problem to be erased. In the end, her name became impossible to separate from the truth. Aurora Skies offered Maya an apology. It came with compensation, public statements, and an invitation to return. They offered her a senior position. They offered to restore the career they had helped destroy. They spoke about rebuilding trust and creating a safer culture. For many people, that offer would have seemed like victory. But Maya understood something they did not. Some doors were not meant to be reopened. She accepted the apology because acknowledgement mattered. She accepted the compensation because justice did not require her to pretend that harm had never been done. But she did not return to Aurora Skies. Instead, Maya used part of what she received to build something that did not depend on anyone powerful deciding who deserved to be heard. She created the Daniel Reed Aviation Fellowship. It began in a modest simulator training center near a small airport, where young people from neighborhoods that had never seen aviation as an option could learn about aircraft systems, emergency procedures, maintenance ethics, and the responsibility that came with stepping into a cockpit. Maya did not teach them that pilots were heroes. She taught them that pilots were human. She taught them that fear was normal, but silence could be dangerous. She taught them that a checklist was not just a list of tasks. It was a promise to everyone who trusted you with their life. She taught them that when something felt wrong, they had the right to ask questions. And perhaps most importantly, she taught them that no title, no paycheck, and no powerful person was worth more than the truth. Evan Cole visited the center months after Flight 718. The storm had changed him too. He had returned to flying after additional training, but he no longer confused confidence with control. He understood that asking for help had not made him weak. It had helped save 186 people. Nora Bell came too. She stood quietly near the simulator room and watched Maya guide a nervous student through an emergency procedure. Nora had seen Maya at her lowest point, standing in a cabin aisle while a powerful man tried to stop her from doing the right thing. Now she saw what had come from that moment. Not revenge, not bitterness, purpose. Captain Luis Herrera eventually recovered and wrote Maya a letter. He did not write it as an airline captain to a former captain. He wrote it as one human being to another. He thanked her for protecting the passengers he had been unable to protect himself. He thanked her for believing in Evan when Evan had begun to doubt himself. And he thanked her for proving that a person's worth could not be decided by the people who had once tried to take everything from them. Years later, passengers still remembered Flight 718. Some remembered the storm. Some remembered the hard landing. Some remembered the woman in the ordinary coat who stood up from seat 34B when everyone else was too frightened to move. But Maya remembered something else. She remembered her father's old notes. She remembered the missing number. She remembered the years when people told her that speaking up would only make things worse. And she remembered the truth that finally carried her through the storm. The sky had never judged her by her past. It had never cared whether she wore a captain's uniform, whether an executive approved of her, or whether a company tried to erase her name. The sky only asked one thing. When people trusted her with their lives, would she respect the truth? Maya Reed did. And because she did, 186 people came home. Because she did, a man who believed he was untouchable finally had to answer for what he had done. And because she did, a new generation of future pilots, mechanics, and engineers learned that courage was not always loud. Sometimes courage was a missing number in a maintenance record. Sometimes it was an old notebook nobody wanted to read. Sometimes it was a woman standing up in seat 34B, even when the most powerful man on the plane wanted her to sit back down. The truth may take time. It may be ignored. It may be buried beneath fear, money, and silence. But when the storm comes, the truth is often the only thing strong enough to guide people home. If this story reminds you that doing the right thing matters, even when no one stands beside you, hold on to that lesson. Because the world does not become safer when brave people stay quiet. It becomes safer when they speak.
Stay down. People like you do not get to explain first.
Most people had already decided what he was.
We already know enough.
To the store security guard, he was an easy target. To the assistant manager, he was the perfect excuse.
I knew something was wrong.
And to the shoppers passing by with their carts and baskets, he was just an uncomfortable scene they could pretend not to see.
This does not feel right.
You should have checked the cameras first.
He noticed the manager watching too carefully,
The truth is still here.
and the young cashier looking terrified because she remembered the truth.
He paid. I saw him pay.
That camera was not supposed to see that.
My version is the one they will believe.
They thought the story would end with a quiet man being blamed, embarrassed, and erased.
No receipt, no proof.
But the man on that floor had spent years protecting records from people who thought power gave them the right to rewrite reality. And before the grocery store ever learned, it had chosen the wrong man to destroy. That morning had begun in the kind of darkness most people never noticed. Not the frightening kind, not the kind that filled headlines, but the slow blue darkness before sunrise, when working people moved through the world while everyone else was still asleep. Marcus had finished mopping the 4th floor hallway of the Bryan County Courthouse just after 5 in the morning. The courthouse was empty then, except for the hum of vending machines, the distant click of old pipes, and the soft squeak of his shoes against the marble floors. At 52, Marcus Hale had learned how to move through important buildings without being seen. He knew which doors stuck in winter, which judges arrived before sunrise, which clerks left coffee rings on polished desks, and which hallways held conversations people assumed no janitor would understand. He wore a faded charcoal hoodie over his maintenance shirt, dark work pants worn thin at the knees, and black shoes that had been repaired more times than replaced. To most people who passed him during the day, he was simply part of the building's background, like a trash bin, a mop bucket, or a light that flickered near the elevators. But Marcus had not always been invisible. Years earlier, before the courthouse had reduced him to a man with a mop, he had worked in the records division, the quiet room where evidence logs, video files, sealed documents, and time-stamped materials were handled with more care than most people ever imagined. Marcus had not been a lawyer, a judge, or a man with a title people respected in public, but he had been trusted with something more fragile than reputation. He had been trusted with the record, and to Marcus, the record was sacred. He believed a time stamp mattered. He believed a receipt mattered. He believed a camera angle, a signature, a missing minute on a file, or a note written in the margin could become the only thing standing between a person and a lie that looked official. He had seen what happened when powerful people treated paperwork like clay, shaping it until the truth became convenient. He had seen ordinary people lose jobs, children, homes, and names because someone with a cleaner suit and a louder voice wrote the first version of the story. That was why Marcus had lost his position. It had happened 7 years earlier, in a case that almost no one remembered now. A young man had claimed he had been mistreated during a detention incident, and the entire dispute came down to a hallway camera file and the time written in the evidence log. The file showed one thing. The amended report suggested another. A superior had asked Marcus to correct what they called a harmless clerical error. The tone had been casual, almost friendly, as if changing a number by 14 minutes was the same as fixing a typo. Marcus had refused. He had not shouted. He had not threatened anyone. He had simply said that the time on the file was the time on the file, and that his initials would not sit beside a lie. In a place like Bryan County, that kind of refusal did not always create a scandal. Sometimes it created something quieter and more efficient. his performance reviews changed. His attitude was questioned. His ability to work well with others became a concern. Within months, the man trusted to protect records was reassigned to building maintenance, and the courthouse learned to speak of him as difficult without ever explaining what he had been difficult about. Marcus accepted the new job because he needed to eat, because his wife Ruth needed medication, and because pride did not pay rent. But acceptance was not the same as forgetting. Every morning, as he pushed his mop past the locked records office, he remembered the kind of people who smiled while asking honest men to bend the truth. He remembered how quickly a room could turn against someone who refused to be useful to a lie. By 5:30 that morning, the first pale light had begun to press against the courthouse windows. Marcus rinsed the mop, folded the cleaning cloths, and checked the small black notebook he kept in his back pocket. It was not fancy. Its corners were soft from years of use, and its cover had been taped twice. Inside were work hours, grocery costs, medication reminders, appointment dates, and little notes written in a careful hand. Some people used phones for everything. Marcus still trusted paper, especially when paper was kept close. On the top line of that day's page, he had written Ruth's kidney appointment, Naya's birthday, and a short grocery list. Oat milk, bread, soup, apples, Ruth's prescription, blue cupcake. The cupcake mattered more than the price should have allowed. Nitya, Marcus's 12-year-old granddaughter, had asked for nothing big that year. She knew money was tight. She knew her grandmother had been tired. She knew her grandfather counted bills at the kitchen table when he thought no one was watching. So she had asked for one blue cupcake from the bakery case at the grocery store near the bus stop. The one with the bright frosting and tiny white sugar stars. Marcus had promised he would bring it home after work. That was the kind of promise a man like Marcus treated seriously. When he stepped out of the courthouse a little after 6, the town still looked half asleep. The sidewalks were wet from an overnight drizzle, and the streetlights gave the pavement a dull silver shine. Marcus pulled his hoodie tighter around his shoulders and walked toward the bus stop with the slow, careful pace of a man whose knees had carried too much for too long. He was tired, but not unhappy. There was a difference. Tired was the body asking for rest. Unhappy was the soul giving up. Marcus had not given up. At home, Ruth would still be asleep in the recliner because lying flat had become uncomfortable. Nia would be getting ready for school, pretending not to care too much about her birthday because she did not want to make anyone feel guilty. Marcus pictured the cupcake in its little plastic container, imagined placing it on the kitchen table, imagined Naya trying to hide her smile and failing. That small picture carried him through the cold morning better than coffee ever could. The grocery store was already open when he arrived. It was one of those clean, modern stores that tried to make ordinary things look expensive. The floors shone under fluorescent lights. The produce was stacked in bright pyramids. Soft music floated above the aisles, cheerful enough to make the place feel welcoming if a person did not know how quickly welcome could disappear. Marcus took a basket near the entrance and moved through the store with the careful focus of someone who knew exactly what he could spend. He chose the bread first because bread was cheaper near the back shelf. Then soup, apples, and oat milk. At the pharmacy counter, he waited quietly while a young clerk looked through the bins for Ruth's prescription. He did not complain about the wait. Marcus had spent too much of his life watching people unload their impatience onto workers who had no power over the system holding them up. When the prescription came, he checked the price, swallowed the worry it gave him, and added the receipt to his notebook. Near the bakery case, he paused longer than he meant to. The blue cupcake sat in the front row, exactly where Naya had described it, bright and almost ridiculous beneath the cold glass. For a second, Marcus felt the weight of the morning lift. It was a small thing, but small things were often where love survived when money could not do much else. He asked for one, watched it placed carefully into a little container, and paid for it separately, so it would not get crushed under the groceries. The cashier who helped him was young, with kind eyes, and the nervous energy of someone still learning how to stand up in a workplace that rewarded silence. Her name tag was there, but Marcus did not need to read it to understand her. He recognized that look, the look of a person who saw more than she said. She noticed his notebook when he tucked the receipt between the pages. She noticed that he thanked her like her work mattered. She noticed that he did not rush her, did not talk down to her, and did not treat the small transaction as beneath him. Later, that would matter. At the time, it was just another quiet kindness in a morning full of ordinary things. But from the customer service counter, Victor Rowe was watching. Victor was the assistant manager, the kind of man who had learned to make authority out of a vest and a clipped tone. He was not the owner. He was not even the store manager. But he had enough control over schedules, complaints, and shift reports to make younger employees fear him and tired customers avoid him. He liked that. It gave shape to a life that had not become as impressive as he once imagined it would. Victor had been under pressure for weeks. Inventory numbers were wrong. Premium items had gone missing. Corporate had started asking questions in careful emails that sounded polite only to people who had never been blamed for anything. Victor knew exactly why the numbers were wrong. He knew which products had been moved, which small thefts he had hidden, and which adjustments he had made to keep suspicion pointed away from himself. But pressure has a way of making dishonest people creative. He needed a story. Not a perfect story, because perfect stories invite inspection. He needed a believable one. A tired older man in worn clothes, a small basket, a separate bakery purchase, a store full of distracted shoppers, a private security lead who already believed the worst about certain people before facts arrived. To Victor, Marcus was not a customer. He was an opportunity. Marcus had no idea he had been chosen. He paid at the self-checkout for the groceries, moving slowly but carefully, scanning each item and placing it into the bagging area. The machine gave him trouble once with the apples, and he waited for assistance without irritation. The young cashier glanced over, helped clear the warning, and watched him finish the transaction. Marcus folded the receipt and placed it into his notebook with the pharmacy receipt and the bakery receipt. Then he set the cupcake on top of the bag, like something fragile enough to deserve its own space. As he turned toward the exit, Victor stepped away from the counter. The moment was almost invisible at first. A manager intercepting a customer near the front of the store was not unusual. A security lead drifting closer from the side aisle was not enough to make most people stop. Shoppers kept moving. Carts rolled. The automatic doors opened and closed with soft mechanical sighs. Everything about the scene looked normal from a distance, and that was what made it dangerous. Victor spoke with the practiced calm of a man performing concern for an audience. He suggested there had been a problem. He implied that Marcus needed to wait. He did not accuse him loudly at first. He was too careful for that. He wanted the attention to gather slowly, wanted people to see Marcus held in place before they heard why. Because once a person looks detained, The crowd begins inventing reasons. Marcus felt the change immediately. It was not fear first. It was recognition. The temperature of the room seemed to shift, not in the air, but in the way people looked at him. A woman near the cereal aisle slowed down. A man with a cart full of bottled water glanced once and then looked away. Someone whispered without knowing anything. The private security lid approached with his jaw set and his mind already made up. His name was Brent Calder, though Marcus did not know it yet. Calder had the posture of a man who believed firmness was the same as truth. He wore a plain dark security uniform, but he carried himself as if the store had given him a kingdom. He did not ask Marcus what happened. He asked Victor what the problem was, and that told Marcus everything about the direction the morning had taken. Victor produced a bag Marcus had never touched. It contained expensive items from a premium shelf, the kind of goods Marcus would not have bought even in a better month. The bag appeared from behind the counter, as if it had been waiting for its cue. Victor said enough for people nearby to understand that he believed Marcus had tried to leave without paying. He kept his voice measured, but there was satisfaction underneath it. He was not discovering a crime. He was presenting one. Marcus reached for his notebook. That small movement made Calder stiffen. The security lid told him not to reach around, not to make things harder, not to act like he could talk his way out of what they had already found. Marcus stopped, not because Calder was right, but because Marcus understood how quickly a normal gesture could be rewritten by someone determined to see danger. He kept his hands visible and explained, as calmly as he could, that he had receipts for everything he bought. But calm did not help him. Calm often angers people who depend on panic to prove their version of events. Calder wanted Marcus defensive. Victor wanted him confused. The crowd wanted him simple enough to categorize quickly. But Marcus stayed measured, and that quiet steadiness made the accusation feel less secure. So Victor added details. He mentioned the high-value items. He spoke of prior losses. He hinted that the store had been watching people like Marcus for weeks, though Marcus had never been part of any such thing. The young cashier heard that and looked up. She remembered the self-checkout. She remembered helping with the apples. She remembered the folded receipt. Her face changed with the first sharp edge of understanding, but fear held her in place. Victor controlled schedules. Victor wrote evaluations. Victor knew how to punish people without making it look like punishment. She was 19, knew and not yet sure courage would protect her from consequences. Marcus saw her hesitation and did not blame her. That was one of the things people misunderstood about the quiet. They assumed silence meant weakness or approval. But Marcus knew silence had many shapes. Some silence was cowardice. Some was survival. Some was the terrible pause before a person decided what kind of witness they were willing to become. Calder stepped closer. Victor stood behind him. The store kept moving around them, but differently now. Shoppers did not stop in a circle like people in movies. Real life was colder than that. They slowed, stared, judged, and kept shopping. A mother pulled her child gently toward another aisle. An older man pretended to compare prices on canned beans while listening to every word. A teenager lifted his phone, then lowered it when Calder looked his way. The humiliation did not need a crowd gathered tightly around it. It only needed enough people to see and choose comfort over truth. Marcus asked them to check the cameras. That should have been the simplest request in the world. In a store with cameras above registers, doors, aisles, and counters, a customer asking for footage should have sounded reasonable. But lies do not like neutral witnesses. Victor's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Calder dismissed the request as if it were a trick. He said the matter was already clear enough, and Victor nodded too quickly. Marcus noticed that too. He noticed the nod. He noticed the security lead standing between him and the exit. He noticed Victor's eyes cutting once toward the freezer aisle and then away. He noticed the young cashier pressing her lips together, as if the truth were physically hurting her. Most of all, he noticed the small red light above the freezer case. It was not one of the obvious store cameras mounted in black domes from the ceiling. It was smaller, placed near a service panel, the kind installed by an outside maintenance company to monitor temperature access and after-hours service. Marcus had seen hundreds of cameras in his old job. He knew the difference between a camera controlled by a building and one maintained by a vendor. He knew that sometimes the most important witness was the one powerful people forgot existed. For the first time that morning, Victor had chosen the wrong man. Not because Marcus was rich, he was not. Not because Marcus had influence, he had very little. Not because anyone in that store was ready to protect him. Most were not. Victor had chosen the wrong man because Marcus understood records the way other people understood weather. He could feel when a story was being built against him. He knew where to look for the thing that would survive after voices finished lying. Still, knowledge did not save him from shame. Calder's voice grew harder. Victor's expression became more wounded and official, as if he were the victim of Marcus's refusal to accept guilt. The cupcake slipped from the top of the grocery bag during the confusion and landed near the wheel of a shopping cart. No one meant to crush it, or maybe no one cared enough to stop it from being crushed. The little blue frosting smeared across the clear plastic lid, and for one painful second, Marcus thought not of the accusation, not of the security guard, not of the watching shoppers, but of Nia. He had promised her. That was the detail that almost broke him. Not the embarrassment, not the way people looked at him, not even the false accusation. Marcus had survived worse things than public judgment. But the cupcake on the floor, bright blue and ruined under fluorescent light, carried a cruelty no report would ever capture. It was proof that lies do not only attack the accused, they reach outward. They touch birthdays, kitchens, sick wives, children waiting at home, and every small hope a tired person has carried through the morning. Marcus lowered his eyes, not in surrender, but to steady himself. He had learned long ago that anger, when displayed by the wrong person in the wrong room, becomes evidence for the other side. So he swallowed it. He let his breathing slow. He kept his face as calm as he could, while the people around him mistook restraint for guilt. Inside, however, he was already preserving the morning, the time, the aisle, the position of the cupcake, the order of the receipts, the camera above the freezer, the cashier's face, Victor's glance, Calder's words. A record could begin in the mind before it reached paper. By the time Marcus was finally led away from the front of the store and into the small back office, the public part of the humiliation had already done its damage. People would remember him as the man stopped near the exit. Some would tell themselves they had seen stolen goods, though they had only seen a bag Victor produced. Others would remember the security guard's confidence and mistake it for proof. A few would feel uneasy later, maybe while unloading groceries at home. But uneasiness was not the same as testimony. In the back office, Victor's performance changed. Without the shoppers nearby, his concern became impatience. Calder began writing an internal incident note, before Marcus had finished explaining. That detail mattered. A fair record listens before it writes. A false one arrives with blank spaces already shaped like conclusions. Marcus asked again for the cameras to be checked. He asked for the self-checkout record, the bakery purchase, the pharmacy receipt, and the freezer camera near the service panel. Each request made Victor more uncomfortable. Calder, however, treated the details as noise. To him, certainty was easier than accuracy. He had already decided which man in the room deserved belief. Marcus was eventually released from the office, but not cleared. That was another kind of cruelty. They did not need to hold him forever to damage him. They only needed to let him leave under a cloud, with his groceries disturbed, his cupcake ruined, and his name attached to an accusation that could follow him in ways no apology could fully undo. Victor kept the premium item bag. Calder kept copies of what he claimed mattered. The receipts Marcus had placed in his notebook were no longer where they had been. That was when the morning became more than humiliation. Marcus noticed the missing receipts before he reached the bus stop. He stood under the gray morning sky with the grocery bag hanging from one hand and the ruined cupcake container in the other. His fingers moved through the notebook once, then again, slowly. The pharmacy slip was still there, tucked between 2 pages. The small list was still there. But the grocery receipt and bakery receipt were gone. For a moment, he simply stood still. A younger man might have rushed back into the store. An angrier man might have shouted. A more naive man might have assumed it was a mistake. Marcus did none of those things. He looked back at the bright entrance, at the shoppers moving in and out as if nothing important had happened there. And he understood that the story had not ended when they let him walk away. It had just become harder to prove. He took out his pen and wrote down the time. That was the first thing Marcus did. Standing beneath the bus stop shelter with the ruined cupcake in one hand and the grocery bag in the other. He wrote the hour, the weather, the number of the checkout lane, the color of the manager's vest, the position of the freezer camera, and the exact moment he realized the receipts were missing. He did not write with trembling anger. He wrote with the careful discipline of a man who had learned that memory becomes stronger when it is anchored to details. The bus came 10 minutes later. Marcus sat near the back, holding the grocery bag close to his knees. People boarded around him with their phones, lunch bags, tired faces, and ordinary morning thoughts. No one knew that the man in the faded hoodie had just been publicly accused, humiliated, and quietly robbed of the very proof that could clear him. That was another cruelty of injustice. The world did not stop for it. Traffic moved. Coffee was poured. School doors opened. People complained about weather and schedules, while someone else's life had already been pushed off balance. Marcus kept looking at the cupcake. The plastic container had cracked on one corner. The blue frosting had smeared against the lid, and the little white sugar stars were pressed into a shapeless mess. It was still technically a cupcake, but it no longer looked like something a grandfather could place proudly in front of a birthday girl. It looked like evidence of carelessness, as if he had failed at the one small thing Nia had asked from him. That thought hurt more than the accusation. When Marcus reached the apartment, the sun had risen enough to make the windows look pale. Ruth was awake in the recliner, wrapped in the old brown blanket she insisted was still good, even though the edges had begun to fray. Illness had made her movement slower, but it had not taken the sharpness from her eyes. She knew Marcus's face before he said anything. Wives who have survived hard years learn to read silence the way others read headlines. Nia was at the kitchen table with her backpack open and one shoe untied, pretending to study a worksheet while secretly watching the door. She was trying to act older than 12. Children in houses with medical bills often learn that trick early. They learn to make their hopes smaller, to ask for less, to smile quickly when adults look tired. But when she saw the damaged cupcake container in Marcus's hand, the pretending fell away. Marcus placed the groceries on the table gently. He apologized without making excuses. He told Nia that something had happened at the store, that the cupcake had been damaged, and that he would make it right. He did not tell the whole story immediately. Not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he could not bear to place the ugliness of that morning directly into her birthday, before she had even gone to school. But Nia saw more than he wanted her to see. She saw the way his fingers moved carefully, as if his wrist was sore. She saw the tightness around his mouth. She saw Ruth sit up straighter, suddenly alert. And she saw the black notebook on the table, open to a page filled with notes that did not look like a grocery list anymore. Ruth asked what they had done to him. Marcus could have softened it. He could have blamed confusion, policy, a misunderstanding, anything that made the world feel less intentional. But marriage had never survived between them on comfortable lies. So he told her enough. He told her that the assistant manager had accused him of taking items he never touched. He told her the security lead refused to check the receipts properly. He told her the crowd watched, and the young cashier looked as if she wanted to speak, but was afraid. He told her that the receipts were missing now, and that a service camera above the freezer might have seen what mattered. The room became very quiet. Ruth closed her eyes, not because she was surprised, but because some pain returns wearing new clothes. She had watched Marcus lose his records job years earlier for refusing to change a timestamp. She had watched people who barely knew him call him difficult, proud, stubborn, impossible. She had watched him take maintenance work with a straight back and a broken heart, because their family needed him more than his pride did. Now, years later, the same pattern had found him in a grocery store. A person with power had written a story, and Marcus had been placed inside it without permission. Nia did not cry right away. She stared at the ruined cupcake, then at her grandfather's notebook, then at his face. In that moment, something shifted in her. Childhood did not end all at once, but sometimes it lost a layer in a single morning. She began to understand that unfairness was not always loud enough for strangers to recognize. Sometimes it happened under fluorescent lights, while people kept shopping. Sometimes it wore a polite vest. Sometimes it spoke in a calm voice and counted on everyone else being too busy to care. Marcus wanted her to go to school. Nia wanted to stay home. Ruth settled the matter in the way she often did, with tenderness wrapped around steel. She told Nia that going to school did not mean forgetting, and staying home would not undo what had happened. Then she told Marcus to sit down and eat something before he started trying to carry the whole burden alone. That was Ruth. Even sick, she could still place order around pain. After Nia left, Marcus and Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the notebook between them. Marcus reconstructed everything from the moment he entered the store. Ruth wrote on a separate sheet while he spoke. She asked practical questions, the kind that forced memory to sharpen. Which register had he used? Which cashier helped with the apples? Was the bakery receipt printed separately? Where exactly had Victor stood? Which side of the freezer aisle held the small service camera? Did the security lead touch the groceries before or after the accusation became public? Did anyone else handle the notebook? Marcus answered carefully. He knew the danger of certainty when memory was still fresh and wounded. He did not exaggerate. He did not fill gaps with guesses. He marked what he knew, what he believed, and what needed proof. That distinction mattered. Lies often win by pretending confidence is the same as truth. Marcus had spent his life refusing that mistake. By mid-morning, Ruth had made one decision. They needed Grace Whitmore. Grace was not family by blood, but she had known Marcus long enough to understand what had happened to him the first time the courthouse turned on him. She was a civil rights attorney, with silver in her hair, patience in her voice, and a reputation for making institutions regret underestimating quiet people. Grace did not chase every rumor, and she did not make promises she could not keep. But when she believed a record had been manipulated, she moved quickly, because she knew evidence had a shelf life when guilty people controlled the shelves. Marcus did not want to call her at first. That was not pride exactly. It was exhaustion. He had been through the machinery before. He knew what it meant to become a case. He knew how people would examine his clothes, his job, his tone, his past, his finances, his family, and his anger. He knew they would ask why he did not act differently, why he did not speak louder, why he did not stay calmer, why he did not produce proof before the proof disappeared. Victims are often put on trial long before anyone admits a wrong has been done. But Ruth reminded him that silence had already cost him once. She did not say it cruelly. She said it as someone who had carried the same wound. The first time Marcus lost his position, they had tried to survive quietly. They had hoped that being honorable would be enough. It had not restored his title. It had not corrected the whispers. It had not taught the people who punished him to fear the truth. This time, Ruth said, they would not hand the lie a quiet room to grow in. So Marcus called Grace. He gave the facts simply. He did not dramatize the humiliation. He did not begin with outrage. He began with the missing receipts and the service camera. That told Grace everything she needed to know about the man on the other end of the phone. Many people call lawyers with feelings first. Marcus called with a chain of custody forming in his mind. Grace listened without interrupting. Then she asked for times, names, descriptions, and any proof still in his possession. When Marcus mentioned the freezer service camera, there was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. Grace knew the value of a camera controlled outside the place where the lie had begun. She told Marcus not to contact the store again on his own, not to post anything, not to threaten anyone, and not to let anger give them a distraction. The first move, she said, had to be preservation. Within the hour, Grace's office sent formal preservation notices to the grocery store, the outside refrigeration company, the security contractor, and the pharmacy system connected to the purchase records. The letters demanded that all footage, transaction logs, incident notes, internal communications, and registered data from that morning be retained. They were not loud letters. They did not need to be. They carried the quiet force of someone who knew exactly where evidence liked to disappear. That was the first turn in the story. At the grocery store, Victor received the notice before lunch. He read it once in the small back office. Then he read it again, slower. His face changed, not because the letter accused him directly, but because it named things he had hoped no one would think to name. The freezer camera, the external maintenance vendor, the transaction logs, the incident note, the preserved receipts, the time window. Victor had expected Marcus to complain, maybe to call the store manager, maybe even to shout into a phone and be dismissed as emotional. He had not expected preservation language. He had not expected a lawyer to move before the end of the workday. Most of all, he had not expected the camera above the freezer case to become important. That little camera had always annoyed him. It belonged to the refrigeration maintenance company, not the store's main security system. It existed because expensive freezer failures could ruin inventory overnight, and corporate did not like losing money to broken equipment. It recorded service access, temperature checks, and movement around the freezer doors. Victor had ignored it because it was not part of the camera system he usually reviewed. It was just another small device with a blinking red light, too ordinary to fear. Now he feared it. Calder did too, though he showed it differently. The private security lead did not panic. Men like Calder rarely panic in a way others can see. Instead, he became more certain, more rigid, more offended that anyone would question his handling of the incident. He told himself the matter would hold because Victor had made the initial complaint and Marcus had looked suspicious. He repeated that phrase in his head until it felt almost like evidence. Looked suspicious. It was one of the most dangerous phrases in the world because it often revealed more about the person looking than the person being judged. By the end of that day, the store manager had been informed. Corporate had been informed. The outside maintenance vendor had been contacted. The incident had moved from a small back office into email threads, where careful people began choosing careful words. No one wanted to admit fault. No one wanted to accuse Victor too quickly. No one wanted to believe that a private security lead had helped bury receipts, or that an assistant manager had created a false accusation to distract from missing inventory. Institutions rarely begin by searching for truth. They begin by searching for exposure. At home, Marcus waited. Waiting was harder than writing the time, harder than calling Grace, harder even than walking out of the store with strangers' judgment still clinging to his back. Waiting gave the mind too much room. He imagined the footage being deleted. He imagined the vendor saying the camera had not recorded. He imagined Victor explaining everything away, Calder doubling down, the cashier staying silent, and the story becoming another fog of maybe and maybe not. Ruth watched him pace the small living room until his knees started bothering him. Then she told him to sit. He did, not because pacing was useless, but because Ruth had always been better at making commands sound like care. Nia came home from school quieter than usual. She had told no one about the cupcake. She had not eaten the lunch Ruth packed. She had spent the day thinking about the way her grandfather wrote things down, about the receipts missing from the notebook, about the cashier who had seen the truth and said nothing in time. Children often understand injustice in simpler language than adults. To Nia, the question was not complicated. Her grandfather had paid. Someone lied. People watched. The proof had to be found. That evening, she sat beside Marcus with the damaged cupcake container between them. He had tried to buy another one from a different bakery on the way home, but the store had only plain vanilla left, and something in him refused to pretend replacement was the same as repair. Nia surprised him by touching the cracked container gently and saying it still counted because he had tried. Marcus looked away then, because grace from a child can break a man more completely than cruelty from an adult. He promised her again that he would make it right. But even as he said it, he knew making it right would not mean only replacing a cupcake. It would mean pulling a lie into the light. It would mean forcing people who had looked away to look again. It would mean entering the machinery he had spent years avoiding and trusting that this time The record might be stronger than the people trying to bend it. The next morning, Grace called. Her voice was controlled, but Marcus heard the energy beneath it. The maintenance company had confirmed the freezer camera existed. It had recorded continuously that morning. Better yet, the footage was stored through the vendor's cloud system, not the grocery store's local office. The store could request access, but it could not quietly erase the original. The files were being preserved. Marcus closed his eyes. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to breathe fully. Grace warned him that preserved did not mean won. Footage had to be reviewed. Angles could disappoint. People could claim context. Lawyers could make simple truths look complicated if they had enough time and money. But she also told him the camera covered part of the aisle near the freezer and part of the path behind the customer service counter. That was enough to matter. Maybe enough to change everything. 2 days later, Grace asked Marcus to come to her office. Ruth insisted on going with him. Naya insisted too, but Marcus hesitated. He wanted to protect her from seeing the worst parts again. Ruth gently reminded him that Naya had already seen the ruined cupcake, the trembling hands, and the silence after. Protecting children did not always mean hiding truth from them. Sometimes it meant letting them see truth handled properly. Grace's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. It smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and raincoats drying near the door. Nothing about it was flashy. The chairs did not match. The shelves were crowded. The walls held framed certificates, community awards, and photographs of people who looked as if they had once arrived there with their names damaged and left with them restored. Grace greeted Marcus with both warmth and focus. She did not pity him. Marcus appreciated that. Pity can make a person feel small, even when it is kindly meant. Grace treated him like a witness to his own life, a man whose memory mattered. She placed a folder on the table, then turned her laptop so the family could see the screen. The first clip was from the self-checkout. It showed Marcus scanning the bread, soup, apples, and oat milk. It showed the young cashier assisting him when the machine paused. It showed Marcus finishing the purchase and placing the receipt into his notebook. The angle was distant, but clear enough. Grace did not speak over it. She let the truth occupy the room without decoration. Ruth's hand found Marcus's under the table. The second clip showed the bakery counter. Marcus paid separately. The cupcake was placed in its container. The receipt was printed. Marcus tucked it away. Nia watched that part with her lips pressed tight, as if she were trying not to feel too much in front of adults. The cupcake, before it was ruined, looked bright and small and innocent. Then came the freezer camera. The footage was not beautiful. It was high, slightly wide, and colder in color than the store's main cameras. But it saw what mattered. It saw Victor near the premium shelf before Marcus ever entered that aisle. It saw him handling the bag of expensive items. It saw him place the bag behind the customer service counter, out of the normal customer path. It saw Marcus pass by later without touching those items at all. Grace paused the video there. No one said anything. Then she let it continue. The camera did not show every angle of the confrontation, but it showed enough. Victor brought the bag forward after Marcus had paid. Calder stepped in. Marcus reached toward his notebook, then stopped. The crowd shifted around them. The young cashier looked over from the self-checkout station. The cupcake fell. A shopping cart wheel caught the edge of the container and crushed it as the shopper moved past, unaware or unwilling to stop. Nia made a small sound then. Marcus reached for her hand. but his eyes stayed on the screen. The final clip showed the back hallway. It was not from the freezer camera, but from another angle Grace had obtained through the preservation demand. It showed Calder alone after the incident, holding folded slips of paper. It showed him place them into his pocket instead of attaching them to the incident materials. It did not capture his thoughts. It did not need to. Some actions are plain enough when placed beside the truth they were meant to hide. Grace closed the laptop. The office felt different after that. Not triumphant. Not yet. Truth, when finally seen, does not always bring immediate joy. Sometimes it brings grief first, because it proves the pain was real, the suspicion was manufactured, and the humiliation did not have to happen. Ruth was the first to speak, but her words were less a question than a verdict. They had known it. Now the record knew it too. Marcus sat very still. For years, people had told him in different ways that records were cold things, that paperwork had no soul, that video could not understand dignity, that timestamps were technical details. But in Grace's office, watching the lie unravel frame by frame, Marcus felt again why he had once sacrificed his position over 14 minutes. The record could not love him. It could not comfort Nia. It could not undo Ruth's worry or restore the cupcake. But it could refuse to forget. And sometimes refusing to forget is where justice begins. Grace explained the next steps. They would not simply release the most shocking clip and hope public anger did the rest. That was how stories became noise. They would build the timeline first. The self-checkout receipt, the bakery purchase, the pharmacy record, the freezer camera, the back hallway footage, the missing slips, the internal note written before Marcus's explanation was complete, the cashier's statement, if she could find the courage to give one, the prior inventory discrepancies connected to Victor. Marcus listened carefully. He was relieved, but he was not naive. He knew the other side would respond. Victor would claim confusion. Calder would claim procedure. Corporate would claim concern. Someone would say the footage lacked context, even though the whole lie had depended on denying context in the first place. Someone would say Marcus should have been more cooperative. Someone would say the security lead was only doing his job. Someone would say mistakes happen. Grace knew all of that too. That was why she looked at Marcus and told him they would not let the case become a debate about his attitude. They would make it about the record, not feelings first, not outrage first. The record first. Because once the record was clear, the feelings would know where to stand. Before they left the office, Nia asked if the video meant everyone would believe him now. It was the kind of question only a child could ask with such painful innocence. Grace did not lie to her. She said some people believe truth when they see it. Some people resist it because it costs them something. And some people only believe it when everyone else does. That was why truth needed witnesses, documents, pressure, and courage all at once. Nia nodded as if she understood more than anyone wanted her to. On the way home, Marcus looked out the bus window at the grocery store when they passed it. Through the glass, he could see shoppers moving under bright lights, pushing carts, comparing prices, choosing cereal, buying flowers, living inside the comfort of ordinary errands. The building looked the same. That bothered him for reasons he could not fully explain. A place where a lie had been built should have looked different afterward. It should have carried a mark. But buildings rarely confess. People have to make them. That night, Grace began preparing the release. Not a reckless post. not an emotional accusation thrown into the internet. A structured statement with timestamps, preserved footage, transaction confirmation, and a clear demand for accountability. She contacted the store's corporate office again, this time with enough attached proof to make denial dangerous. She contacted the security contractor. She prepared to contact local media if they chose silence over action. Victor did not sleep much that night. Neither did Calder. But Marcus did, for the first time since the morning in the store. Not deeply, not without waking once to check the notebook on the bedside table, but enough to let his body rest. He had spent years believing the truth mattered even when nobody thanked him for protecting it. Now, at last, the truth had begun protecting him back. By sunrise, the story was no longer just his memory. It was a timeline. It was footage. It was receipts. It was a young cashier deciding whether fear would own her voice. It was a granddaughter learning that dignity sometimes needed documents beside it. And it was a quiet man in a faded hoodie, standing at the edge of a fight he never wanted, realizing that the people who tried to erase him had left their own fingerprints all over the lie. Grace did not release the evidence that afternoon. She knew better than to throw truth into the world before giving it a spine. A raw clip could be twisted. A single angle could be questioned. A few seconds could become entertainment, argument, or noise. What Marcus needed was not noise. He needed a record so complete that every excuse would have to walk past its own reflection before reaching the public. So, Grace built the timeline carefully. She placed Marcus's notebook beside the self-checkout log. She placed the bakery receipt beside the footage of the cupcake purchase. She placed the pharmacy time beside the bus schedule. She placed Victor's movement near the premium shelf beside the moment the planted bag appeared at the counter. She placed Calder's internal incident note beside the video, showing that the note had been written before Marcus's explanation had been properly recorded. Then she placed the missing receipts beside the back hallway footage, where folded slips of paper moved into the wrong hands and out of the official story. By the time she finished, the lie no longer looked like a misunderstanding. It looked designed. Marcus sat across from her while she reviewed it all, his hands folded around the black notebook he had carried for years. Ruth sat beside him, quiet but steady. Naya sat closer than usual, not because she was afraid of the office, but because she wanted her grandfather to feel that he wasn't standing alone anymore. On the screen, the grocery store looked ordinary. Bright lights, clean floors, carts, a bakery case, people moving through their errands. And inside all that ordinary brightness, a lie had been placed like a trap. That was what made the footage so disturbing. No one had needed darkness. No one had needed an alley, a locked room, or a dramatic threat. The harm had happened in public, under lights, beside shelves of cereal and bread, while ordinary shoppers decided the scene was none of their business. Grace understood that this was the part people would recognize. Not everyone had been falsely accused in a grocery store, but many people knew what it felt like to be judged before being heard. Many knew what it meant for a confident person with a title to be believed faster than a quiet person with proof. Before releasing anything, Grace gave the store one final chance. Her letter was direct. She told corporate that the footage, transaction records, witness information, and preserved notes confirmed Marcus had paid for his items, had not touched the premium goods, and had been falsely accused in a way that caused public humiliation and emotional harm. She demanded a public correction, an apology naming the wrong, immediate action against Victor, full disclosure from the security contractor, protection for the cashier, and compensation that recognized not only the ruined groceries, but the damage to Marcus's dignity. The response came the next morning. It was polished, careful, and empty. Corporate expressed concern. They said they were reviewing the matter. They asked for patience. They claimed they wanted to avoid rushing to judgment, even though their employees had rushed to judgment when Marcus was the one on the floor. They did not name Victor's conduct. They did not admit the receipts had been removed. They did not apologize to Marcus directly. Most of all, they asked Grace not to release anything publicly while their internal review continued. Grace read the email once, then set it down. Marcus did not need her to explain. He had heard that language before. It was the language of institutions buying time, hoping fatigue would do what denial could not. It was the same kind of smooth language that had followed him out of the records division 7 years earlier, when refusing to change a timestamp had somehow become a question about attitude and teamwork. The words were different, but the shape was familiar. This time Marcus did not bend. He gave Grace permission to release the evidence. The statement went out that evening. It was not emotional in the way people expected. It did not beg for sympathy. It did not decorate pain. It laid out the morning with timestamps, receipts, preserved footage, and a clear explanation of what the video showed. It said Marcus had been falsely accused after paying for his groceries. It said a store manager had introduced items Marcus never handled. It said a private security lead had ignored available proof. It said receipts later disappeared from Marcus's notebook. It said the freezer service camera, forgotten by the people who built the lie, had preserved the truth. For the first hour, only a few people noticed. A local reporter shared it, then a community organizer, then a courthouse employee who remembered Marcus from the records division and wrote that he had once been punished for protecting evidence too carefully. That one sentence changed the temperature of the story. People began looking more closely. They watched the clip of Victor placing the bag. They watched Marcus paying at the self-checkout. They watched the cupcake fall and be crushed while people continued shopping. They watched the young cashier's face as she realized what was happening. And then they watched Marcus, calm, humiliated, and observant, noticing the camera no one else remembered. By midnight, the store's silence had become louder than any statement it could have issued. The next morning, news vans arrived outside the grocery store. Corporate closed the entrance for an hour and called it a security concern. Employees were told not to speak to reporters. Victor did not come to work. Calder's contractor announced that he had been placed on leave pending review. The store manager released a short message about taking the allegations seriously, but by then, the public had seen enough polished language to recognize fear wearing a suit. The cashier came forward that afternoon. Her name was Lena Ortiz. She was 19, still new enough to believe that doing a job well might protect her, and old enough to realize that workplaces often protect power before truth. She contacted Grace first because she was terrified of losing her job. Grace took her statement privately and made sure she understood what could happen. Lena said Marcus paid. She said she helped clear the self-checkout warning. She said she saw him place the receipt into his notebook. She said Victor had been unusually focused on Marcus before the accusation. She said she wanted to speak earlier, but fear had locked her throat. Marcus did not condemn her for that fear. He knew how fear worked when the person above you controlled your schedule, your hours, and your ability to pay rent. He also knew that courage delayed was not the same as courage denied. Lena had come forward before the lie could fully settle. That mattered. Her statement pushed the story further. Other employees began to talk. One remembered Victor moving premium items near the stockroom on previous shifts. Another remembered inventory reports that never seemed to match what workers saw. A third said Victor had warned employees not to question management decisions in front of customers. Piece by piece, the image of a concerned assistant manager collapsed. What appeared in its place was a man protecting himself by creating suspicion around someone else. Corporate suspended Victor officially by the end of the week. The word suspended did not satisfy Nia. She wanted stronger words. She wanted fired, exposed, punished, named. Marcus understood her anger, but he had learned that justice often moved slower than the wound. It did not mean it was not moving. Grace reminded the family that the first fall of a powerful person is rarely the final consequence. It is only the moment when distance begins. People who were once protected by institutions suddenly become liabilities to them. That was happening to Victor now. Calder tried to defend himself. Through the security contractor, he claimed he had acted based on the information provided by store management. He claimed Marcus had been uncooperative. He claimed the scene was tense. He claimed his decisions were reasonable under the circumstances. But the footage weakened every sentence. It showed Marcus calm. It showed the receipts. It showed Calder ignoring requests to verify the purchases. It showed him writing the internal note in a way that placed conclusion before investigation. The more Calder explained, the worse he looked. Grace filed the lawsuit before the public conversation could fade. The complaint named the grocery store, Victor, the private security contractor, and Calder. It described false accusation, negligent supervision, intentional emotional harm, mishandling of proof, and a pattern of conduct that allowed a low-status customer to be treated as guilty because it was convenient. But the most powerful part of the complaint wasn't legal language. It was the story of a man who had spent years protecting records from manipulation, only to be nearly destroyed by people who assumed no one would check the record. That part traveled. Church leaders repeated it. Local teachers discussed it with older students. Workers at the courthouse whispered about it in elevators. People who had once ignored Marcus while he mopped their hallway began remembering that he had been more than a maintenance worker. Some remembered him from the records division. Some remembered his quiet refusal to alter a time entry years earlier. A few remembered how quickly he had disappeared from that department afterward. Then came the envelope. It arrived at Grace's office with no return address. Inside were copies of old courthouse documents, performance reviews from before Marcus's refusal, all positive. Notes from after his refusal, suddenly critical. Internal emails discussing his lack of flexibility, a memo suggesting reassignment, and a copy of the disputed time entry request that had cost him his position without ever being called punishment. Grace studied the papers for a long time. They did not directly say the courthouse had retaliated. Documents created by careful people rarely confess so openly. But the pattern was there. Before Marcus refused to alter the record, he was reliable, precise, trusted, and professional. After he refused, he became difficult, resistant, and not a good fit. The words had been chosen to hide the truth, but the dates placed them under a light they could not escape. When Marcus saw the documents, he did not smile. Vindication is not always joyful. Sometimes, it feels like standing in front of an old wound and realizing it was exactly as deep as you remembered. For 7 years, Marcus had carried the weight of being quietly demoted, while others called it complicated. Now the paper said what his heart had known. He had not lost his place because he failed the work. He had lost it because he respected the work more than the people above him did. Nia read the documents at the kitchen table. This time, she cried openly. Not because of the grocery store, but because she understood that her grandfather's suffering had a history. The ruined cupcake had been painful. The false accusation had been cruel. But the old records showed something larger. Marcus had been paying for honesty long before she was old enough to understand the cost. The lawsuit changed after that. Grace added the old courthouse documents, not as a separate fight, but as context for who Marcus was and why the grocery store's assumption had been so wrong. He was not a man inventing a story after being embarrassed. He was a man with a documented history of protecting truth, even when truth punished him. The very quality Victor and Calder had mistaken for weakness was the thing that made Marcus dangerous to their lie. Discovery began. That was when the defendants lost control. Emails showed Victor had been warned about inventory discrepancies before Marcus entered the store. Schedule notes showed he had been alone near the premium goods before the accusation. Transaction records confirmed Marcus paid. Internal messages showed corporate employees worrying less about Marcus's innocence and more about exposure. Calder's incident note had inconsistencies that grew sharper when placed beside video timestamps. The more documents Grace collected, the more the defense shifted from denial to minimization. They began calling it a mistake. Grace called it a sequence. A mistake is one wrong turn. A sequence is a path. Victor moving the goods, watching Marcus, producing the bag, ignoring the request for camera review, allowing the public accusation, and participating in the removal of receipts was not a single misunderstanding. Calder accepting Victor's version, dismissing Marcus's receipts, documenting guilt before verification, and keeping proof out of the record was not one bad moment. The harm was built step by step, and every step had a person standing on it. Victor broke first. In deposition, he tried to sound offended. He said he was protecting the store. He said inventory pressure had made everyone alert. He said Marcus had seemed suspicious because he moved slowly, kept looking around, and carried a notebook. Grace let him say all of it. Then she placed the video stills in front of him one by one. Victor near the premium shelf. Victor carrying the bag. Victor placing it behind the counter. Victor watching Marcus. Victor producing the bag after Marcus had paid. Victor looking toward the freezer aisle when Marcus asked for cameras. By the end, Victor's confidence had drained out of him. He admitted that he had handled the bag before the accusation. Then he admitted he had not seen Marcus touch those items. Then he admitted he had been under pressure over missing inventory. Each admission came smaller than the last, as if the truth had to be dragged out through his teeth. But it came. Calder lasted longer. He was the kind of man who had built his self-image around certainty, and certainty can become a locked room. He insisted he had acted reasonably. He insisted Marcus's calmness had seemed calculated. He insisted the situation required control. Grace asked him whether control mattered more than accuracy. He avoided the question. She asked whether he had checked the receipts before writing the incident note. He did not answer directly. She asked whether a person in plain clothes was easier for him to doubt than a manager in a vest. That question stayed in the room long after his lawyer objected. The case did not reach a full public trial. That disappointed some people, but Grace told Marcus that justice was not measured only by courtroom drama. After the depositions, after the documents, after the public pressure, and after the security contractor realized Calder had become impossible to defend cleanly, the defendants asked for mediation. Marcus did not want a quiet settlement that buried the truth. Grace made that clear before the first meeting began. No agreement would exist without public correction. That became the line. The final resolution came with money, but money was not the heart of it. The store issued a public statement acknowledging that Marcus had paid for his purchases, had been wrongly accused, and had been treated in a way that violated basic standards of dignity and fairness. Victor was terminated. The company referred his conduct related to inventory manipulation for further review. Calder was dismissed by the security contractor and later lost his license to work in private security after the review board found he had mishandled the incident and failed to preserve customer proof. The store agreed to retrain employees, revise accusation procedures, protect workers who came forward, and require immediate preservation of footage when a customer disputed an accusation. Grace also secured something Marcus had not expected. A correction letter was sent to the courthouse leadership, accompanied by the old documents and the public record of the grocery case. It did not force the county to rewrite history completely, but it forced them to acknowledge that Marcus's prior work and records had been professional, careful, and respected before the disputed reassignment. It also led to a small public recognition from a county oversight committee, praising the importance of evidence integrity and naming Marcus as someone who had upheld that principle. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. The ceremony was small. Marcus almost did not attend. He did not trust ceremonies easily. Too many institutions used plaques to cover the cracks they refused to repair. But Ruth told him that Nia needed to see the room say his name correctly. So he went. He wore his best jacket, the one Ruth had brushed twice that morning. Nia stood beside him with her shoulders straight. Grace stood in the back, watching like a person who had seen many victories and knew none of them arrived clean. When Marcus's name was spoken, he did not feel pride first. He felt the younger version of himself standing somewhere inside him, the man who had refused to change 14 minutes, and then walked out of the records division with his future quietly damaged. He wished that man could have known this moment would come. Not because it would undo the loss, but because it would prove the loss had not been meaningless. Afterward, Nia asked if he felt better. Marcus told her the truth in the gentlest way he could. He felt lighter, but not untouched. There are some things justice repairs, and some things it can only honor. The public apology did not erase the grocery store floor. The settlement did not uncrush the cupcake. Victor's termination did not give back the years Marcus had spent being treated like a man who had fallen because of his own attitude. But the lie had not won. That mattered. The record had held. A week later, Marcus returned to the grocery store. He went alone first. Ruth wanted to come. Nia wanted to come. Grace advised him not to push himself. But Marcus knew there was a difference between avoiding a wound and letting it own the map of your life. He needed to walk through those doors again under his own power. The store looked the same and different. The floors still shone. The lights still hummed. Customers still moved through the aisles with baskets and carts. But near the customer service counter, Victor was gone. Near the entrance, a new sign explained customer verification procedures without naming the case. Employees glanced at Marcus with recognition. some embarrassed, some respectful. Lena saw him from the self-checkout station and froze for half a second before stepping forward. She did not offer a dramatic apology in front of everyone. She did something better. She treated him carefully, normally, respectfully. She asked if he needed help finding anything. Marcus thanked her. That was all. Sometimes restoration is not a speech. Sometimes it is the ordinary courtesy that should have been there from the beginning. He walked to the bakery case. There, behind the glass, was a row of blue cupcakes with white sugar stars. Marcus looked at them for a long time. The worker behind the counter waited without rushing him. Finally, he bought one, then another. Then a small box of 4, because this time he could afford to bring enough home for everyone. He paid, took the receipt, looked at it, and placed it into his notebook. At home, Naya laughed when she saw the box. Not because the old pain was funny, but because joy had returned to a place where humiliation had once tried to settle. Ruth made tea. Grace came by later with documents for Marcus to sign, but stayed for a cupcake because Naya insisted. They did not pretend everything was simple now. Ruth still had appointments. Bills still arrived. Marcus still worked hard. The world had not transformed into fairness overnight, but something inside the family had changed. Nia no longer saw her grandfather as only a tired man who worked before sunrise. She saw him as someone who had protected truth even when truth cost him. Ruth no longer had to carry the old courthouse wound in silence. Grace no longer had to wonder whether the system that punished Marcus would ever be forced to face even a small part of what it had done. And Marcus, though still humble, no longer moved through the world quite as invisibly as before. With part of the settlement, he started a small fund. He named it the Hale Evidence Integrity Fund, though Nia teased him for choosing such a serious name. The fund helped ordinary people preserve records quickly when they were accused by employers, landlords, stores, agencies, or anyone else with more power and better paperwork. It helped pay for copies, letters, legal consultations, and emergency preservation requests. Marcus did not want fame. He wanted fewer people standing alone under fluorescent lights while someone else wrote the first lie. He began speaking at community centers. At first, he hated it. Marcus had never enjoyed being watched. But he understood that his story could teach what his silence could not. He told people to keep receipts, to write times down, to ask for cameras early, to save messages, to notice who controls the record. He told them that documentation was not distrust. Sometimes it was protection. Sometimes it was dignity given a place to stand. Nia came with him when she could. She sat in the back with a notebook of her own, writing things down in a hand that looked more and more like his. Years later, Marcus would remember that more clearly than any news clip. Not the headlines, not the settlement, not Victor's downfall or Calder's dismissal. He would remember his granddaughter learning that truth was not just something a person felt. It was something a person protected. One evening, after a community meeting, Naya asked him whether he ever wished he had shouted that day in the store. Marcus thought about it longer than she expected. Then he told her that part of him did. Part of him wished he had made every shopper stop, every employee listen, every liar feel the force of his pain. But another part of him knew that anger alone would have been used against him. The world often demands perfect calm from the wounded and perfect trust in the powerful. That is not fair. But Marcus had learned how to survive inside that unfairness long enough for the record to speak. Nia did not like that answer. Marcus did not either. But truth is not always satisfying in the places where pain first asks for satisfaction. Sometimes the deeper victory comes later, when the lie has exhausted itself and the quiet details remain standing. Months passed. The grocery store changed in small ways. Employees received training that no one could dismiss as optional. Customer accusations required documented verification before public confrontation. Footage preservation became automatic when disputes were raised. Workers had a protected way to report pressure from management. None of it made the store perfect. No policy can. But policies are doors. And before Marcus, people like him had often been left outside them. Lena kept her job and eventually became a shift lead. She carried the memory of her fear with humility, not as punishment, but as instruction. When new employees joined, she told them that silence could feel safe in the moment and still become a wound later. She never used Marcus's story carelessly, but the lesson shaped the way she treated people. Victor did not return. For a while, he tried to describe himself as a victim of public outrage, but the inventory findings followed him. People who build lies often expect sympathy when the lie collapses on them. Marcus did not celebrate Victor's